Power cuts, empty buildings, unpaid workers, silent factories. This isn't rural Africa. It's China in 2024. Entire cities are going dark. Local governments are defaulting. And the so-called economic miracle? It's unraveling in real time. Behind the glossy propaganda and censored headlines, China is buckling under the weight of its own success and turning back into what it once was. A broke, brittle, tightly controlled society that's running out of money, people, and time. This isn't a soft landing, it's a controlled crash. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some experts now say China isn't just slowing down, it's collapsing into a third world future. Let's start with the biggest wealth destruction event in modern history. And no, that's not hyperbole. We're talking about more money evaporating than was lost in the 2008 financial crisis, the dot-com crash, and every other economic disaster of the last century combined. China's property market was once worth over $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. housing market and stock market combined. For decades, it seemed invincible. Prices only went up. Families poured their life savings into apartments. And why wouldn't they? Real estate was the one investment the Communist Party seemed to guarantee. But that guarantee just shattered into a million pieces. As of late 2025, Chinese home prices have fallen for 29 consecutive months. Nearly 2.5 years of relentless decline with no bottom in sight. Goldman Sachs warns that without significant intervention, prices could drop another 20 to 25%. Putting values at roughly half their peak. In Tier 3 cities, which account for 60% of China's GDP, the collapse has been even more severe. Real estate agents haven't made sales in months. And here's what makes this catastrophic. Roughly 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in real estate. So when those apartment values collapse, so does everything middle-class families thought they had. Meet the Wangs, a couple from Shenzhen who did everything right. They saved for 15 years, took out a mortgage in 2021, put down their entire life savings, about $400,000, on a pre-sale apartment from one of China's biggest developers. The building was supposed to be finished by 2023. They'd already picked out furniture, planned where the crib would go. The building was never finished. The developer ran out of money. Construction stopped at the 15th floor. And the Wangs? They're still paying on a mortgage on a concrete skeleton they'll probably never live in. Their down payment? Gone. Their monthly payments? Funding nothing but interest to a bank. Their future? Stolen by a system they trusted. They're not alone. Over 20 million pre-sold apartments across China remain unfinished. 20 million families paying mortgages on empty air, servicing debt for homes that may never exist. And the protests they've tried to organize? Censored, suppressed, erased from the internet as if they never happened. Remember Evergrande? China's largest property developer defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. $300 billion! That's more than the GDP of Finland. Then Country Garden collapsed with another $187 billion. Together, China's property developers now owe more than the entire GDP of France. And most of that money came from ordinary families who trusted the system. The mortgage boycotts that erupted in 2022 spread across over 100 cities. Desperate homebuyers refused to pay for apartments that weren't being built. The government scrambled to censor the protests and launch rescue construction programs. It wasn't enough. It still isn't. You can't restore trust once it's been vaporized. New buyers aren't showing up. In the first half of 2025, new home sales fell another 4%. Construction starts dropped nearly 20%. And the government that was supposed to backstop everything? It's drowning in its own problems. But the property collapse isn't just destroying family wealth, it's bankrupting the very governments meant to save it. Here's something most people don't understand about China. Local governments don't really collect taxes the way Western governments do. For decades, they funded themselves by selling land to developers. Buy cheap farmland on the outskirts, sell it at massive markups, pocket the difference. At the peak, land sales made up 30 to 40% of local government revenue. That money built the roads, paid the teachers, funded the police, constructed the hospitals, maintained the infrastructure that made China's cities function. Now it's gone. With developers bankrupt and nobody buying land, that revenue stream has collapsed. Land auction values have cratered to around 3 trillion yuan, barely half their peak. Over 10% of land offered for auction last year had zero bidders. Not low bids, zero bids. Nobody wanted it at any price. And local governments across China are facing a fiscal apocalypse nobody prepared for. In Henan province, civil servants had their salaries slashed by 50%. In Guangdong, China's wealthiest province, home to tech giants and manufacturing powerhouses, government workers saw pay cuts of 25 to 30%. Some cities can't afford to keep their streetlights on at night. Others have stopped maintaining roads, collecting garbage, or funding public services they'd provided for decades. Tianjin, a metropolis of over 13 million people, got so desperate they started selling off government office buildings just to make payroll. The local government literally couldn't afford its own offices anymore. Chen Wei spent 20 years as a highway construction contractor in Sichuan province. His company built roads, bridges, overpasses, the infrastructure that made China's interior cities accessible. Last year, the local government owed him 43 million yuan for completed projects. He's received nothing. He had to lay off 200 workers. Some of them haven't been paid in 8 months. They keep promising the money is coming, he told a reporter before the interview was scrubbed from the internet. But there's nothing left to give. His story is playing out across the country. Because here's where it gets truly terrifying. Chinese local governments have been hiding debt for years through something called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs. These are shell companies that borrow money off the books to fund infrastructure projects. High-speed rail lines that nobody rides, financial districts that sit empty, airports with no passengers, all built with borrowed money that was never supposed to appear on any official balance sheets. The IMF estimates this hidden debt now exceeds 65 trillion yuan. Compared with official local government debt of nearly 48 trillion yuan, the total reaches a staggering 134 trillion yuan. That's roughly $18 trillion, bigger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined, bigger than China's entire official GDP. And most of these LGFVs can't pay their bills. Their median return on assets is around 1%, but their average interest rate? Over 5%. The math doesn't work. Nearly half of them would be operating at a loss without massive state subsidies. A leading Chinese economist recently revealed that local governments have accumulated over 10 trillion yuan in unpaid arrears to contractors and civil servants by the end of 2024. Workers who build highways haven't been paid. Companies that supplied materials are owed millions. Retirees are seeing benefits cut. The whole system is choking on IOUs nobody can honor. Beijing announced a 12 trillion yuan debt restructuring package in late 2024, the largest policy intervention ever targeting local governments. They called it a solution. Analysts called it extend and pretend, because that package covers maybe 25% of the actual problem. The rest? They're just rolling over loans, pushing payments into the future, hoping something magically changes. It won't. And just when you think the picture couldn't get darker, the factories that made China rich are packing up and leaving. For 40 years, Made in China was stamped on everything you owned. Phones, clothes, electronics, toys, furniture, appliances. China was the world's factory floor, and that status lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. It was the foundation of the entire economic miracle. That era is ending. In May 2025, Apple CEO Tim Cook made an announcement that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The majority of iPhones sold in the United States would now come from India. Not China, India. And Vietnam would be the country of origin for almost all iPads, Macs, Apple Watches, and AirPods sold to American consumers. Let that sink in. Apple, the company that practically built its empire on Chinese manufacturing, is moving out fast. The numbers are staggering. In the first half of 2025, iPhone production in India surged 53% compared to the previous year. India exported over $22 billion worth of Apple products. The volume of made-in-India smartphones shipped to the United States jumped 240% year over year. And for the first time in history, India overtook China as the top exporter of smartphones to the United States. India now accounts for 44% of U.S. smartphone imports. The world changed while most people weren't paying attention. Apple isn't alone. Samsung closed its last factory in China years ago and now produces the majority of its smartphones in Vietnam and India. Nike makes more shoes in Vietnam than in China, a reversal from just a decade ago. Sony, Dell, HP, Google, they're all diversifying away from China at an unprecedented speed. Even Chinese companies are fleeing their own country. BYD, China's electric vehicle giant, and one of the few genuine Chinese success stories, is building factories in Mexico, Thailand, Hungary, and Indonesia rather than expanding at home. Why is everyone running? First, Chinese labor isn't cheap anymore. Factory wages have tripled in the last decade. Workers in Vietnam cost half as much. In India, even less. The low-cost advantage that made China the world's factory, the core competitive edge that powered decades of growth, is gone. Second, Xi Jinping's government has been unpredictable and paranoid. That 2023 anti-espionage law spooked every foreign company operating in China. When basic market research can get you arrested for spying, when checking production numbers at your own factory might constitute espionage, executives start looking for the exit. Foreign direct investment collapsed by over 80%. Companies aren't just diversifying, they're fleeing. Third, COVID exposed the catastrophic danger of depending too much on one country. When Chinese factories shut down during lockdowns, global supply chains collapsed overnight. Companies couldn't get parts, products couldn't ship. The just-in-time model became just too bad. Executives learned a brutal lesson they won't forget. Concentration is existential risk. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, the workers themselves are disappearing. But there's something even more permanent than fleeing factories. Something China can never buy back, build back, or recover. Something that guarantees decline for generations to come. In 2024, China's population fell for the third consecutive year. More coffins than cradles. More deaths than births. And the gap is widening every single year. The numbers are brutal. 9.5 million babies were born in 2024, but nearly 11 million people died. That's a net loss of almost 1.5 million people in a single year. And demographers say this is just the warm-up act. China's fertility rate has collapsed to around 1 child per woman. To maintain a stable population, you need 2.1. China isn't even halfway there. It's now approaching South Korea's catastrophic 0.73, the lowest fertility rate on Earth. Some Chinese cities have rates even lower than that. The one-child policy worked. It worked too well. It broke something fundamental in Chinese society that may never heal. But here's what really terrifies Beijing. By the end of 2024, 310 million Chinese were over 60 years old. That's 22% of the entire population, up from 18% just 5 years ago. Within a decade, China will have 400 million senior citizens, more elderly people than the entire population of the United States. more retirees than workers in many regions. Who's going to support them? Remember the one-child policy? For decades, the government limited families to a single child. Now, China has what demographers call 4-to-1 families. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, all depending on one child. One person expected to financially support 6 while building their own career and family. It's mathematically impossible. It's emotionally devastating. The pension system is already cracking. In 2022, 14 provinces reported pension shortfalls. By 2035, analysts estimate China's pension system will need an additional $300 billion every single year just to stay solvent. That's more than China's entire military budget. And the pool of workers contributing to that system shrinks every year, while the pool of retirees demanding payouts explodes. The working-age population has been shrinking since 2012 and lost nearly 7 million workers in 2024 alone. That's like losing the entire workforce of a medium-sized European country every single year. Factory workers complain they can't hire enough hands. Pension administrators watch contribution pools evaporate. And retailers see fewer consumers walking through doors with money to spend. Meanwhile, marriages have collapsed to historic lows. In 2024, only 6.1 million couples got married, down from over 13 million just a decade ago. Divorces rose to 2.6 million. Fewer marriages mean fewer babies. Fewer babies mean fewer future workers. Fewer workers mean a dying economy supporting an exploding population of elderly dependents. And here's where those cold statistics meet real human despair. In August 2025, youth unemployment hit 18.9%, the highest since Beijing changed how they measure joblessness. Back in June 2023, the official rate hit a record 21.3%. Then, something remarkable happened. They stopped publishing the data entirely. The government claimed they needed to improve their statistical methodology. What they really needed was to hide numbers that made them look catastrophically incompetent. When they finally resumed publishing with their new, improved methodology that conveniently excludes students, the rate had magically dropped. Convenient timing. Independent estimates suggest the real unemployment rate for young Chinese might be closer to 25 or 30%. A generation of college students can't find work. Engineering students with advanced degrees are delivering food on electric scooters. Medical school graduates are driving rideshare. Law school graduates are selling insurance door to door. This year alone, 12.2 million new graduates entered the job market. 12 million young people looking for opportunities that don't exist, looking for careers that have evaporated, looking for a future their parents promised them. Take Liu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate from a top Shanghai university. His parents spent their entire savings on his education, tutoring, exam prep, university fees, because they believed education was the ticket to a better life. Now he's been job hunting for 8 months. He delivers food on an electric scooter to pay rent, making barely enough to cover his share of a cramped apartment he splits with 3 other unemployed graduates. His parents' retirement fund? Gone. Their dreams of their son supporting them in old age? Shattered. This wasn't supposed to happen. The deal was simple. Study hard, get a degree, climb the corporate ladder, buy an apartment, start a family, retire comfortably. That was the formula. That was the path. That was the contract between generations. But the ladder is gone. The rungs have snapped, and millions of young Chinese are looking around, realizing the system they sacrificed their youth for has nothing to offer them. That's why they're lying flat. It's a movement that terrifies the Communist Party. Young Chinese refusing to chase careers that don't exist, refusing to buy homes they can't afford, refusing to have children they can't support, refusing to work overtime for bosses who will lay them off anyway. Just opting out, lying flat, doing the absolute minimum to survive. Some call it let it rot, an acceptance that everything is broken, so why bother trying to fix it? The government hates it. State media runs endless propaganda about patriotism and hard work and sacrifice for the nation. Officials lecture young people about their duty to society. Universities are now required to teach courses on love education to encourage marriage and childbirth. But you can't motivate people with slogans when their reality is broken. You can't shame people into optimism when their prospects are garbage. Some aren't just lying flat, they're running. Immigration inquiries have surged to record levels. Wealthy Chinese are moving money to Singapore, buying property in Canada and Australia, sending their kids abroad with instructions never to return. They call it run philosophy, escape while you still can. And it's not just the ultra-rich. Middle-class families are looking for any exit they can find. Student visa applications, investment immigration, marriage to foreigners, anything to get out before the doors close. So, what happens when an entire generation gives up on the system their parents built? For 40 years, the Communist Party had a deal with the Chinese people, an unspoken contract written in rising living standards. Give up political freedom, no voting, no protests, no dissent, no questioning the party. And, in return, we'll make you rich. We'll improve your life every year. Your children will do better than you did. Trust us. That deal is shattering. The property bubble didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed faith. When your government promises stability and delivers collapse, when your safe investment evaporates overnight, when your children face worse prospects than you did despite working twice as hard, what exactly are you sacrificing your freedom for? Consumer confidence is cratered to historic lows. People aren't spending. They're hoarding cash, saving for disasters they can feel coming. The wealth effect has turned brutally negative. Everyone feels poorer, so everyone acts poorer, which makes everyone actually poorer, which makes everyone feel even worse. The middle class that was supposed to power China's future, it's shrinking. For the first time since economic reforms began in 1978, the Chinese middle class is contracting instead of expanding. The number of billionaires has been cut in half. Luxury spending has collapsed. Even basic consumption is stagnant. Xi Jinping's response? More control, more surveillance, more nationalism, more censorship. State media pumps out relentless propaganda about China's glorious rejuvenation and inevitable rise. Schools teach unquestioning loyalty to the party. Cameras with facial recognition watch every street corner. Social credit scores track every purchase, every movement, every association. Critics disappear into silence. Journalists vanish. Activists get re-educated. The message is clear. Endure the hardship for the glory of the nation. Accept the suffering as a necessary sacrifice. Trust the party to guide you through. But here's the thing about nationalism. You can't eat it. You can't pay rent with it. You can't save it for retirement or feed it to your children. When the economy is delivering prosperity, nationalism is a nice bonus. When the economy is failing, nationalism is a desperate distraction from a government that has nothing else to offer. And people are starting to notice. Not everyone is accepting this quietly. In late 2022, something unprecedented happened. Citizens took to the streets in Shanghai, Beijing, and other major cities. Not over wages or housing, but over COVID lockdowns that had strangled their lives for 3 years. Some held blank sheets of paper, a silent protest against censorship. Others chanted for freedom. A few even called for Xi Jinping to step down. The protests were crushed within days. Participants were tracked down, detained, re-educated. But for a brief moment, the facade cracked. The party saw what happens when enough people lose enough hope. They saw that beneath the enforced compliance, frustration runs deep. That memory haunts Beijing. It's why the surveillance has intensified. It's why the nationalism has gotten louder. because they know the anger is still there, just waiting. This is how nations collapse. Not with invasions or revolutions or dramatic upheavals, but with a slow, grinding erosion of hope. One family at a time, watching their savings evaporate. One graduate at a time giving up on their dreams. One couple at a time deciding not to have children they can't afford. One elderly parent at a time realizing their one child can't support them. The property market won't recover because there aren't enough buyers. There aren't enough buyers because there aren't enough young people with money. There aren't enough young people because birth rates collapsed decades ago. And birth rates won't recover because young people can't afford to have kids, can't find stable jobs, can't see a future worth bringing children into. Every crisis feeds the next. It's a doom loop with no visible exit. China spent 40 years building the world's most impressive economic machine, gleaming cities that rose from rice paddies, bullet trains connecting metropolises, factories that supplied the entire planet. It was supposed to prove that authoritarianism could outperform democracy, that the future belonged to Beijing. Instead, it proved something darker. You can't build a miracle on debt, favorable demographics, and endless construction. But miracles don't last. The debt comes due, the demographics turn, the gleaming towers become monuments to hubris. What we're watching isn't a slowdown, it's not a rough patch, it's not a cycle that will correct itself with the right policies. It's a country that got old before it got rich, a country running out of workers, running out of buyers, running out of believers. A country where the young have stopped dreaming and the old have no one to care for them. China isn't just slowing down, it's collapsing back into what it once was. And here's the thing, China won't collapse alone. When the world's second largest economy tanks, everyone feels it. Those supply chains companies have spent decades building, they're being torn apart and rebuilt. That cheap stuff at every store, it's getting more expensive. Those treasury bonds China holds, they might need to sell them. The global economic order that emerged after 1990, it's being rewritten in real time. So, what do you think? Is there any path out of this spiral? Or is the Chinese miracle finally irreversibly over? Let us know in the comments. And if this opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the stories reshaping our world. Because this story isn't ending, it's just getting started.
China thought it could win a trade war with America. It was wrong. Dead wrong. Total economic chaos is sweeping across China. As Trump's massive tariffs hammer Chinese manufacturing, the world's factory floor is grinding to a halt. Export orders have vanished overnight, wiping out millions of jobs and sparking massive protests across the country. The CCP promised economic prosperity in exchange for political control. Now that bargain is collapsing, and with it, possibly China itself. What happens when 1.4 billion people realize their economic miracle was built on a foundation of sand? Let's break down how China's economy is getting absolutely crushed in this escalating tariff war. President Trump didn't just reimpose the tariffs from his first term, he doubled down with crushing force. New tariffs hitting 60% on Chinese electronics, 100% on electric vehicles, and 50% on industrial machinery have created an economic shockwave that's reverberating through every sector of China's economy. But it gets so much worse. The tariffs aren't just coming from America. India just slapped 12% tariffs on Chinese steel. South Korea is targeting Chinese goods. Even Brazil is distancing itself from Chinese imports. What China feared most is happening, a coordinated global response that's strangling its export-dependent economy from all sides. And in November, the EU imposed tariffs of up to 45.3% on Chinese-built electric vehicles to prevent a flood of cheap BEVs into the European market. The manufacturing collapse is happening faster than anyone predicted. According to Reuters, China's factory activity fell sharply in April, with the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index dropping below 49 for the first time in 6 months, signaling a significant contraction. But cold statistics don't tell the human story. In Guangdong province, once China's manufacturing heartland, factories are shutting down at an alarming rate. Major companies are blocking their equipment from being moved as executives flee without paying workers. Apple announced plans to shift U.S. market iPhone production entirely to India. The CCP's response? They're blocking the move. Chinese authorities are literally holding factories hostage, refusing to let companies relocate their equipment and operations. This desperate move reveals just how panicked Beijing has become, and it's about to get much, much worse. The social contract in China has always been simple: political obedience in exchange for economic prosperity. That bargain is now shattering before our eyes. Worker protests are erupting across China with a frequency and intensity that's shocking international observers. From Dao County in Hunan Province to Suning City in Sichuan and Tonglia City in Inner Mongolia, thousands of workers from shuttered factories are flooding the streets, demanding unpaid wages and protesting mass layoffs. At Shangda Electronics in Sunying, workers shouted strike after not being paid since the start of the year. In Xi'an, migrant workers complained they hadn't received wages since February. In Dao County, hundreds of Guanjin sports goods workers protested after their factory shut down without providing compensation or benefits. Patience is running out. Goldman Sachs analysts estimate that at least 16 million jobs across China are directly at risk due to Trump's 145% tariffs. Around 9 million jobs in China's manufacturing sector are directly exposed to the tariffs, and this is just the beginning of the carnage. The wave of factory closures is gaining momentum. What started as isolated incidents has morphed into a nationwide crisis. In Tongliao, desperate construction workers climbed rooftops, threatening to jump unless they were paid. At an LED plant near Shanghai, thousands confronted supervisors after months without pay. Factory owners across the country report their hemorrhaging clients, with some forced to sideline 30% of their workforce after major U.S. buyers canceled orders. The CCP's worst nightmare is materializing, economic grievances transforming into political unrest. The scale of the crisis is so massive that even China's sophisticated censorship apparatus can't hide it anymore. Workers are sharing their stories faster than censors can delete them, creating a snowball effect that's rapidly building momentum. Here's the hidden crisis few are talking about. China's economic collapse is shattering global supply chains in ways that will impact consumers worldwide. For decades, China positioned itself as the indispensable link in virtually every manufacturing process. The country contributes approximately 30% of global manufacturing added value and controls critical choke points in nearly every industrial sector. But this dominance is now China's greatest vulnerability. A recent CNBC supply chain survey revealed the shocking reality. Manufacturing is fleeing China at unprecedented rates, but it's not coming back to America. Instead, companies are frantically searching for new low-tariff regimes in Vietnam, India, and Mexico. The economic ripple effects are just beginning. China's strategy of controlling critical choke points is backfiring spectacularly. Take semiconductors. China accounts for about 60% of global semiconductor demand, but produces only 13% of global supply. Their Made in China 2025 initiative aimed to achieve 70% self-sufficiency in high-tech industries, but Trump's tariffs have demolished those ambitions overnight. The clearest example is in rare earth minerals. For years, China has monopolized the processing of these critical resources needed for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. Beijing weaponized this advantage by restricting exports multiple times in recent years. Now, as manufacturing collapses and global companies seek alternatives, this leverage is rapidly evaporating. Companies that spent decades building specialized supply chains in China are facing catastrophic disruptions. One Fortune 100 executive described it as having to rebuild a century of industrial infrastructure in a matter of months. The chaos is especially evident in the electronics sector. Tech companies that depend on Chinese components are reporting delivery delays of up to 6 months and price increases of 45% or more. Many American retailers are canceling orders from China entirely, creating a cascading effect throughout the supply chain. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. As foreign companies pull out of China, the factories supplying those companies lay off workers, who then can't afford to buy products, leading to further economic contraction. Even as China reels from the shock of Trump's tariffs, the CCP is enacting a desperate strategy to maintain control over global supply chains. Chinese companies are rapidly expanding into Southeast Asia, establishing shadow factories that maintain Beijing's influence while circumventing U.S. tariffs. In Vietnam alone, Chinese manufacturing investment has exploded since 2022, with similar trends seen in Mexico. The shift reflects a strategy effort to bypass Western tariffs by embedding Chinese production deeper into key global supply chains. The China Plus One strategy, where companies maintain production in China while adding capacity in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, or Mexico, is now being weaponized by Beijing. Rather than allowing Western companies to truly diversify away, the CCP is ensuring that Chinese firms lead the expansion into these markets. In other words, the supply chain isn't moving out of China's orbit, it's just being redeployed under its control. At the same time, China is tightening its grip on the upstream resources that power global tech. While it produces just 13% of the world's semiconductors, it processes roughly 95% of rare earth elements, critical for everything from electric vehicles to precision-guided missiles. As one expert put it, China isn't letting go of the supply chain, it's just extending it to countries with better access to Western markets. It's a strategy that creates a dangerous illusion of diversification. While Western companies believe they're reducing their exposure to China, many are simply sourcing the same goods from Chinese-owned factories operating in places like Vietnam and Mexico. But behind this global repositioning, China's domestic manufacturing base is showing signs of collapse. In a startling trend, American manufacturers have reported that some Chinese suppliers have vanished overnight, taking deposits, defaulting on contracts, and walking away from facilities without warning. The apparel industry, once a pillar of Chinese exports, has been hit especially hard. One major clothing company in Zhejiang cleared out with over $4.2 million, leaving more than 100 small processing factories unpaid. And this isn't just an isolated case. Dozens of desperate workers have gathered at government offices demanding justice, some even threatening to jump from buildings in protest. Electronics factories are faring no better. At Shangda Electronics in Sunying, workers have not been paid since the start of the year. The company has also failed to make Social Security contributions for nearly 2 years. At once thriving manufacturing hubs like Dongguan Gogo Garment, which employed over 10,000 workers at its peak, only 1,700 remained before the factory finally shut down entirely. The pattern is consistent across sectors. Orders dry up, production slows, workers are laid off in waves, and ultimately, factories close without warning, often with months of unpaid wages. Even China's vaunted tech manufacturing is crumbling. Chinese authorities recently reported that an average of 31 semiconductor companies went bankrupt every day last year. This collapse has only accelerated as tariffs choke off export markets. Perhaps most alarming is the rate at which worker protests have exploded across the country. According to monitoring groups, protests in the manufacturing sector increased tenfold in early 2025 compared to the end of 2024. China's collapsing economy isn't just a Chinese problem. It's triggering a global economic shockwave that could lead to recessions across multiple continents. The first casualties are global commodity markets. Australia's iron ore exports, Brazil's soybean industry, and Chile's copper mines are all reporting massive drops in demand as China's manufacturing sector contracts. The Baltic Dried Index, which measures shipping costs for raw materials, has plunged over 30%, a clear indicator of collapsing global trade. Luxury brands are feeling the pain too. LVMH, Porsche, and other high-end retailers have issued profit warnings as China consumer spending evaporates. But it's the financial ripple effects that have economists most concerned. The yuan is weakening rapidly against the dollar, forcing China's central bank to burn through its foreign exchange reserves at an alarming rate. Chinese corporate bonds are trading at distressed levels, and international investors are fleeing Chinese equities at a pace not seen since the 2015 market crash. What makes this crisis different from previous economic downturns is its potential to trigger cascading failures across the global financial system. China holds approximately $800 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. If Chinese authorities need to liquidate these holdings to manage their domestic economic crisis, American borrowing costs could spike overnight. Major banks are warning clients to prepare for unprecedented volatility. One recent J.P. Morgan analysis warned that a disorderly unwinding of China's positions in global markets could trigger liquidity crises in multiple asset classes simultaneously. The consensus among economists is grim. According to a recent CNBC supply chain survey, 63% of respondents expect a recession to hit the U.S. economy this year as a result of the tariff war with China, with roughly half predicting a consumer spending pullback by the second quarter. As one analyst put it, this isn't a normal trade dispute. We're witnessing the unwinding of the most complex economic relationship in history, and there will be casualties. While Trump's tariffs were meant to bring manufacturing back to the United States, the reality is proving far more complicated and potentially damaging for American consumers. A comprehensive CNBC supply chain survey reveals that most companies have no plans to reshore production to the U.S. despite the massive tariffs. The biggest obstacle? Cost. Over half, 57% of companies, cited it as the primary barrier, while another 21% pointed to the difficulty of finding skilled labor. The harsh truth is this: rebuilding domestic manufacturing would be financially devastating for most businesses. According to the same survey, 47% of companies estimate that relocating to the U.S. would more than double their current costs. So instead of reshoring, companies are pivoting to the next cheapest option. Vietnam, Mexico, and India have become the biggest winners from China's manufacturing exodus, with 61% of companies planning to relocate there instead of coming home. But this global supply chain shuffle still hits American consumers hard. The Tax Foundation estimates Trump's tariffs will amount to an average tax hike of nearly $1,300 per U.S. household in 2025. Smaller American businesses and startups are particularly vulnerable. Many lack the capital to build domestic factories and were forced to rely on Chinese manufacturing to bring their products to market. As Bruce Kamenstein, member of New York Angels and founder and former CEO of cleaning products company Casabella, lamented in a recent CNBC supply chain survey, small consumer companies that started with an innovative idea do not have the capital to invest in building factories. Some industries face even steeper costs. The Consumer Technology Association projects a 45% jump in prices for laptops and PC hardware alone. Similar increases in other goods could spark a new wave of inflation, just as the Federal Reserve was preparing to cut rates. Even job creation isn't guaranteed. Economists warn the disruption could cause layoffs in sectors reliant on affordable imported components. In a cruel twist, policies aimed at bringing jobs home may end up eliminating them instead. And for China, this isn't just a trade loss, it's an existential threat. The U.S. is its second largest export market. A shrinking American appetite for Chinese goods means a direct hit to Chinese factories, revenue, and economic stability. For an export-driven economy already under immense pressure, that's a blow it can't afford. Beijing's response reveals just how desperate the situation has become. The Chinese government is rolling out emergency measures that would have been unthinkable just months ago. First, they've abandoned their growth targets. After decades of promising 5 to 6% annual GDP growth, officials are now refusing to even provide forecasts. Second, they're implementing strict capital controls to prevent wealthy Chinese from moving money offshore. Bank withdrawals over $5,000 now require advance notice and justification. Third, they're ramping up nationalist propaganda to unprecedented levels. State media is flooded with anti-American rhetoric, portraying the economic crisis as a foreign attack rather than a policy failure. The most desperate move? The CCP is forcing state-owned banks to lend to failing companies that have no hope of repayment. According to the Financial Times, Chinese banks have been instructed to roll over existing loans and extend new credit lines to struggling exporters, creating a ticking time bomb of non-performing loans that could eventually collapse the entire banking system. These aren't the actions of a government managing a temporary downturn. These are the panic moves of a regime fighting for survival. And all of this is happening at the worst possible time. China's economic collapse couldn't be more catastrophically timed. The country is already facing a demographic crisis of epic proportions. China's birth rate has plummeted to record lows, just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, according to Statista. This puts China in the worst possible position, getting old before getting rich. By 2040, nearly 30% of China's population will be over 65, creating an enormous burden on a social security system that's already strained to the breaking point. Without economic growth to fund retirement and healthcare costs, China faces a demographic time bomb that could trigger social unrest on a scale the world has never seen. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences predicts China's main pension fund will run dry by 2035. But with the current economic collapse, that timeline could accelerate dramatically. What happens when hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese discover their retirement savings are worthless? We may soon find out. If you think America's 2008 housing crisis was bad, what's happening in China right now is apocalyptic. For decades, the Chinese middle class poured their life savings into property, viewing it as the only safe investment in a country with limited options. Approximately 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in real estate, compared to just 34% in the United States. Now, that wealth is evaporating at breathtaking speed. Chinese housing prices have dropped for 36 straight months with no bottom in sight. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden have defaulted on billions in debt, leaving millions of prepaid apartments unfinished, empty concrete shells that stand as monuments to broken dreams. The housing collapse is creating a doom loop for local governments, which rely on land sales for roughly 40% of their revenue. With property markets frozen, these local authorities can't fund basic services. Some cities can't even pay their employees. The province of Henan made headlines when it began paying civil servants with groceries instead of money. This isn't a normal recession. This is an economic system coming apart at the seams. As if economic collapse weren't enough, China is simultaneously facing an existential water crisis that magnifies its problems to catastrophic levels. 90% of China's groundwater is polluted, according to environmental data. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces water shortages so severe that experts question whether the region will remain habitable. This water crisis magnifies the economic problems in terrifying ways. Without clean water, factories can't operate, farms can't irrigate crops, cities become unlivable. China's solution, the massive south-to-north water diversion project, is proving inadequate. Despite costing over $62 billion, it addresses only about 5% of northern China's water deficit. The grim reality is that China simply lacks the most fundamental resource needed for economic recovery: water. No amount of government stimulus or policy adjustment can create water where there is none. The manufacturing sector's contribution to China's economy cannot be overstated. It accounts for approximately 25% of China's total GDP and has been the cornerstone of its development for decades. In 2024, China contributed around 30% of the world's manufacturing added value, maintaining its position as the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse for 15 consecutive years. The country's exports have been the backbone of its growth strategy, with China being the second largest supplier of U.S. goods in 2024. U.S. imports from China rose by 2.8% to $438.95 billion last year. That economic engine is now sputtering to a halt. The chaos is evident in the manufacturing data. China's factory activity dropped to a 16-month low in April, sliding below the critical 50-level threshold that separates growth from contraction for the first time since January. UBS has downgraded China's 2025 growth forecast to a shockingly low 3.4% from 4%, assuming the Sino-US tariff hikes will remain in place. This would be China's lowest growth rate in decades outside of the COVID pandemic. We think the tariff shock poses unprecedented challenges to China's exports and will set forth major adjustment in the domestic economy as well, UBS analysts explained in their downgrade notice. The nation that once boasted of economic invincibility is now desperately trying to reassure markets and citizens that it can weather this storm. These projections may still be too optimistic. With tariff-induced manufacturing job losses accelerating and domestic consumption faltering, real growth could fall well below 3%, a scenario that would represent an existential crisis for the Communist Party's legitimacy. The collapse is happening despite China posting deceptively strong 5.4% growth in the first quarter, before Trump's tariffs fully hit the economy. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's tariffs will increase federal tax revenues by $163.1 billion in 2025 alone, or 0.54% of GDP, making them the largest tax hike since 1993. For Chinese exporters, this translates to a devastating blow, as the AETR, average effective tariff rate on Chinese goods, rises to an unprecedented 33.5%. China's products are simply being priced out of the market. But there's a hidden danger most analysts have missed. The U.S. economy depends on Chinese machinery to make everything from cars to electronics in American factories. According to experts, about 40% of Chinese exports to the U.S. are intermediate goods, not final products. This hidden exposure means that American manufacturing could face severe supply chain disruptions as the trade war intensifies. Chinese exports to the U.S. will likely plummet by 80% over the next 2 years, according to Capital Economics. The massive impact on Chinese factory towns will be catastrophic, potentially leading to the most significant social upheaval China has seen in decades. When workers can't feed their families and homeowners watch their life savings vanish, the social contract binding Chinese citizens to their government begins to fray. China's collapse is reshaping the global economic landscape with stunning speed. We're witnessing the birth of a new world order. Countries that once hitched their futures to China's rise are pivoting away. Vietnam, India, Mexico, and others are rapidly positioning themselves to capture manufacturing capacity fleeing China. American companies are scrambling to rebuild supply chains outside China, creating new manufacturing hubs across Southeast Asia and Latin America. The geopolitical implications are even more significant. China's aggressive foreign policy, funded by decades of economic growth, is now unsustainable. The ambitious Belt and Road Initiative is effectively dead, with promised infrastructure projects abandoned across Asia and Africa. Taiwan is breathing a sigh of relief as China's military ambitions are constrained by economic reality. Invading Taiwan requires economic strength China no longer possesses. The global power balance is shifting before our eyes. Where does China go from here? 3 paths emerge, each with profound consequences for global stability. Scenario 1: economic recovery. The CCP implements dramatic reforms, opens markets, and somehow convinces global manufacturers to return. This seems increasingly unlikely given the severity of the current collapse and the CCP's reluctance to relinquish control. Scenario 2: sustained decline. China limps along with an anemic growth for decades, becoming the first major economy to grow old before growing rich. This scenario means decades of social unrest, political instability, and declining global influence. Scenario 3: system collapse. The economic crisis triggers political upheaval that the CCP cannot contain. This scenario could lead to anything from democratic reforms to civil war, with profound implications for global security. Which path China takes will define the 21st century, but one thing is certain: the era of Chinese economic dominance is over. The mighty dragon that was supposed to overtake America has been brought to its knees by tariffs, demographics, environmental degradation, and its own rigid political system. The question now isn't whether China's economy is collapsing, it's how far and how fast it falls. China's stunning economic collapse raises profound questions for all of us. Is this the beginning of China's century of humiliation 2.0? Or could this crisis ultimately lead to positive reforms and a more sustainable Chinese economy? What happens to global inflation, supply chains, and financial markets as the world's second-largest economy unravels? And perhaps most importantly, who will fill the economic vacuum left by China's retreat from global manufacturing? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Is China's economy truly finished, or could they somehow stage a miraculous comeback? And how will this collapse affect your country's economy? Now go watch 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real. And China's collapse into poverty is worse than you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the most important geopolitical developments reshaping our world. Thanks for watching.
China is running out of cash. Not headlines, not slogans, cash. Local governments are selling assets, transferring operating rights, digging up old tax cases, raising hidden fees. National budget revenue is falling. Land sale income, the financial backbone of the system, is shrinking fast. And when a state built on constant growth suddenly can't generate enough new money, it doesn't stop. It feeds on itself. It pulls revenue forward. It converts future income into present survival. It squeezes the very businesses it needs to recover. This isn't a crash. It's something colder. China is eating itself alive, and the machinery is already in motion. To understand why China's system is devouring itself, we first need to understand the machine that built it, and why that machine is always one stumble away from turning on its creators. For 4 decades, the Chinese state ran one of the most aggressive developmental models in modern history. New cities, expressways, airports, rail lines, and infrastructure civilization advancing at a speed the world had never seen. And the unspoken deal was simple. Accept the political system, and in return, living standards rise. Every year, without exception. But here's what most people miss. That deal wasn't built on productivity or innovation alone. It was built on momentum, on the assumption that tomorrow's growth would always pay for today's debts, that next year's revenue would always cover this year's commitments, that property values would keep climbing forever, propping up household savings, bank balance sheets, and government budgets all at the same time. When growth is treated not just as desirable, but as essential, when the entire governing bargain depends on the assumption that next year will always be richer than this one, the moment it falters, well, that becomes more than an economic problem. It becomes a test of systemic survival. And the system had a fatal flaw that was hardwired into its foundations from the jump. Here's how China's fiscal machine actually worked. Local governments are responsible for delivering most public services: education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, social programs. But they've never controlled enough tax revenue to pay for any of it. That gap between what local governments owe and what they actually earn has defined China's fiscal architecture for decades. So, how did they fill it? Well, with 2 mechanisms. Both were extraordinarily powerful during the boom years, but both now are broken. The first was land finance. Local authorities would sell land use rights to developers and pocket the cash. At its peak in 2021, land sale revenue hit a staggering 8.7 trillion yuan. A Stanford research brief found that in 2019, 38% of local government revenue came from land sales and land-backed financing alone. That's not a supplementary income stream. That's the engine room. The second was off-balance sheet borrowing through local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These were state-owned entities that helped localities raise debt for infrastructure and urban development, without the borrowing ever appearing on official government books. The Reserve Bank of Australia traced how these vehicles became the go-to mechanism for funding public investment after China's 1994 tax reforms created a structural funding gap at the local level. And sitting at the very center of all of it, holding the entire structure together like a keystone, was the property sector. Not just a market, the hinge that simultaneously connected household wealth, developer balance sheets, bank collateral, and local government budgets. The IMF estimated that property-related activity accounted for about 20% of GDP during the decades of rapid growth. That's not just a big number. It means 1/5 of everything China produced was tied, directly or indirectly, to real estate. Chinese families had roughly 70% of their household wealth locked in property, compared to about 35% in the United States. For hundreds of millions of people, their apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was their pension, their savings account, their children's inheritance, and the proof that their system worked. Developers relied on pre-sales to fund construction. Banks relied on property as their primary collateral. And local governments relied on land sales to keep the lights on, the schools open, and the debt serviced. So when property slows, local budgets weaken. When local budgets weaken, LGFVs come under pressure. And when LGFVs weaken, infrastructure stalls and financial stability is threatened. When households watch their apartment values crater, well, they stop spending. This isn't a chain of isolated problems, it's a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and every link makes the next one worse. That loop just got triggered. Hard. China's property downturn didn't arrive as a single event. It unfolded like a sequence of detonations, each one exposing a deeper layer of vulnerability that the boom had papered over. In 2020, Beijing introduced the 3 red lines, rules designed to rein in developer leverage and cool an overheated market. The intent was reasonable, the timing was catastrophic. Instead of stabilizing the sector, the rules ripped the bandage off and exposed how deep the rot actually went. After a major developer defaulted in late 2021, confidence collapsed across the industry. Pre-sales dried up almost overnight. Construction halted. Developers burned through their working capital, and millions of Chinese families who had already paid for apartments watched their building sites go dark. Their life savings frozen in concrete shells that may never be finished. The fiscal damage was immediate, and it hasn't stopped. By 2025, land use rights transfer revenue had fallen to 4.15 trillion yuan, down 14.7% from the year before, and more than half of its 2021 peak. That's 4 straight years of double-digit decline. Resident land sales revenue specifically plunged roughly 65% from peak level in 2020. And in January of 2026, the Ministry of Finance confirmed that national general public budget revenue fell 1.7% in 2025, the first outright contraction since the pandemic year in 2020. Now, these aren't abstract accounting categories. This is the cash that pays civil servant salaries, maintains roads, funds schools, and services local debt. When this money disappears, everything downstream starts to crack. Some provinces have already slashed government worker pay by double digits. Cities have dimmed streetlights and delayed infrastructure maintenance. The facade of stability is holding, but behind it, the machinery is running on fumes. And the debt wasn't standing still, it was compounding. In November of 2024, Beijing announced a 10 trillion yuan debt relief plan, raising the local government debt ceiling and directing new special purpose bonds toward replacing hidden debts.
The stated goal was to reduce hidden debt from 14.3 trillion yuan to 2.3 trillion by 2028.
But the IMF put total LGFV liabilities at a jaw-dropping 111% of GDP, a number that reveals just how deep the off-balance sheet exposure really runs. The engine hasn't just stalled, though. It's dragging the entire system backward. The mechanisms built to compensate for fiscal gaps have themselves become the biggest stress points in the system. But here's the thing about governments running out of money. They don't just accept it, they adapt, they improvise. And when the normal channels dry up, they start looking at everything around them. Every public asset, every operating right, every untapped fee as a potential lifeline. And in China's case, that improvisation has turned into something far more troubling than a budget shortfall. There's a phrase making the rounds in Chinese policy circles: eating next year's grain today. It perfectly describes what's happening across hundreds of local governments that can no longer balance their books through normal means. They're selling the future to survive the present. Local authorities have started auctioning off operating rights for everything they can monetize: school cafeteria franchises, public parking lots, sanitation management contracts, even funeral home concessions. One district auctioned rights to what officials called the low-altitude economy, essentially abstract rights involving drone logistics and airspace use. The winning bidder? A company owned by the same local government that ran the auction. Now, that's not revenue generation. That's a system moving money from one pocket to the other and calling it income. In other regions, officials have been accused of what Chinese commentators call turning stone into gold, repackaging low-value or non-commercial public resources as high-value assets to inflate their books. One locality assessed river sand and gravel reserves across 3 rivers at nearly $1 billion. Another province auctioned 20 years of desilting and disposal rights for over 800 million yuan to a state-owned enterprise that had been registered just 11 days before the sale. The central government is well aware of what's happening. In December of 2024, the National Development and Reform Commission issued explicit guidance warning against treating concession transfers as tools for selling assets or disguised local government financing. They specifically prohibited using auctions to select concessionaires for basic services like roadside parking and garbage collection, a direct acknowledgement that these mechanisms were being weaponized for short-term fiscal survival, not legitimate public service reform. Chinese policy analysts have warned against treating public resources as things to be sold once and for all, stressing the long-term governance risks of converting future flexibility into immediate cash. Even the IMF noted that authorities intend to accelerate asset sales as part of debt resolution, meaning that these assets are no longer instruments of development, they're fuel for survival. But if you think auctioning parking spots and funeral homes sounds desperate, wait until you hear what's actually happening to private businesses, because this is where China eating itself alive turns truly dangerous, and where the damage may be irreversible. Tax authorities have been digging through decades of corporate records, not for compliance, but for cash. In 2024, a liquor-related company was hit with a demand for roughly 85 million yuan in taxes allegedly owed since the 1990s. A chemical engineering firm faced a bill of nearly 100 million yuan. Another company halted production entirely after being ordered to pay 500 million yuan in back taxes. And a real estate developer told a reporter that his company had been forced to pay hefty taxes stretching back 2 decades, with the local government making sure nobody spoke about it to the media. As he put it, when the tiger is hungry, what do you think happens to the lamb? Whether those tax liabilities were legitimate, that's almost beside the point. The signal that they send is devastating. When a government retroactively enforces old tax claims during a fiscal emergency, well, businesses stop investing. They hoard cash. They delay hiring and expansion. They hedge against a system that no longer feels predictable or safe. And then there's what Chinese observers call ocean fishing. Local police crossing jurisdictional boundaries to confiscate funds under the guise of criminal investigations. In one widely reported case, police from a city in Guangdong province traveled over 900 kilometers to Wuhan, detaining 25 employees of a social media company and coerced its financial staff to transfer 300 million yuan to police-linked accounts. The allegation was that the company operated an illegal online casino. And this practice became so widespread that China's own state-run media called it a cancer damaging the business environment. The Ministry of Public Security demanded an end to it. A state council document issued in late 2024 announced strict measures to regulate enterprise-related inspections, explicitly forbidding profit-driven inspections and improper cross-regional enforcement that burdens firms. China's courts stepped up oversight of what they described as illicit cross-region and profit-driven law enforcement, seeking to protect business rights from enforcement overreach. Now, these were not minor policy tweaks. These are central authorities openly admitting that parts of the state apparatus have turned predatory. But acknowledging doesn't dissolve the incentive. As long as local budgets keep hemorrhaging cash, the pressure to extract won't stop, no matter what Beijing decrees from the top. And here's the trap that makes this so destructive. Every yuan squeezed from the private sector is a yuan that won't be invested, won't create jobs, and won't generate future tax revenue. Fiscal stress drives extraction. Extraction kills confidence. Dead confidence weakens growth. Weaker growth deepens fiscal stress. Round and round. The system is feeding on the very organs it needs to recover. And every rotation of the cycle leaves the patient a little weaker than the last. So why doesn't Beijing just stimulate its way out? Borrow more, build more, spend more. That playbook has worked for decades. Well, because the conditions that made that possible no longer exist. Let's begin with the demographics. In January of 2026, the National Bureau of Statistics reported that China's population fell by 3.39 million in 2025, the steepest peacetime annual decline on record. Only 7.92 million babies were born. That's down 17% from the year before, the lowest figure since records began in 1949. One prominent demographer noted the 2025 birth count was roughly equivalent to levels last seen in 1738, when China's total population was just 150 million. Meanwhile, 11.31 million people died. That's the highest annual death toll in over 5 decades. Over 323 million Chinese are now aged 60 or above. That's 23% of the entire population. By 2035, that number is projected to reach 40 million, roughly equal to the combined populations of the United States and Italy. An aging society doesn't just slow growth, it increases the cost of everything. pensions, healthcare, elder care, while the workforce that funds it all keeps shrinking year after year. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree. And today, it's closer to 4. And by the mid-2030s, it'll be 2. The math doesn't work. And China can't immigrate its way out of the problem like the way the US or Canada can. Its system isn't built for that. And the appeal simply isn't there. And the young people who are supposed to carry that burden, they can't find work. The urban unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds, excluding students, sat at 16.5% as of December of 2025. That's the revised number, by the way. And there's a story behind that revision. China's Statistics Bureau suspended publication of youth unemployment data entirely in June 2023, right after its rate hit a record 21.3% and became an international embarrassment. When they resumed months later, they had quietly changed the methodology to exclude students from the count. Now, even under the new, more flattering formula, the rate still spiked to 18.9% in August of 2025, after a record 12.2 million university graduates flooded the job market all at once. A generation trained for white-collar careers is now delivering food and working factory floors, if they could find work at all. Then there's the property sector itself. The IMF has argued that China isn't transitioning from a boom to a mild slowdown. It's heading toward a new normal, in which demand for new housing is structurally weaker due to demographics, urbanization patterns, and massive excess inventory. Real estate development investment fell nearly 14% in the first 3 quarters of 2025 alone. And prices in most major cities are still sliding. The fiscal machine, built on continuous land transactions and rising developer confidence, cannot simply be restarted with a single round of stimulus. The fundamental demand that powered it for decades, that's no longer there. The World Bank reached a complementary conclusion. Durable improvement in household consumption requires deep structural reform, particularly reforms that give local governments sustainable, stable revenue sources instead of forcing them to rely on volatile, land-linked funding that evaporates the moment that the property cycle turns. And here's what ties all of this together into something truly alarming. The demographic decline means fewer workers and more retirees. Fewer workers means less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means tighter local budgets. Tighter budgets mean more extraction from businesses. More extraction means less investment and fewer jobs. And fewer jobs, well, that means young people spend less, they marry less, and have even fewer children, which accelerates the demographic decline. Every thread in this crisis connects to every other thread, and they're all pulling in the same direction. The tools that built the boom are now trapped by the costs that they created. Debt is heavier, property is weaker, the population is older and shrinking faster than anyone projected, and confidence in the market, in the government's promises, in the future itself, is more brittle than at any point in the reform era. Which brings us back to the central question of this entire story. What happens when a system built on endless growth can no longer grow fast enough to sustain itself? Well, it doesn't explode. It does something quieter, and in many ways, more dangerous. It starts converting its own future into short-term survival, selling rights, securitizing cash flows, raiding private sector liquidity, pulling revenue forward from years that haven't arrived yet, dismantling long-term capacity to maintain the illusion of short-term solvency. China's leadership isn't blind to the danger. The debt relief packages, the warnings against predatory enforcement, the attempts to put a floor under the property market, all of it shows a government that understands the spiral that it's caught in. But understanding and escaping are not the same thing. The structural mismatch between local obligations and local revenues hasn't been resolved. The property sector hasn't recovered. The demographic trajectory has only accelerated further in the wrong direction. And the incentives driving local officials to extract, auction, and squeeze are as powerful today as they were a year ago. Every concession right sold today is flexibility lost tomorrow. Every retroactive tax raid is a business that won't expand next quarter. Every yuan pulled forward is a yuan that won't be there when the next crisis hits. This is what cannibalization looks like in a modern economy. Not famine, not war, just a slow grinding conversion of long-term capacity into short-term survival. Until the storehouse is thinner, the options are fewer, and the future costs, well, more than the present can afford. And the implications stretch far beyond China's borders. When the world's second-largest economy enters a structural fiscal crisis, the ripple effects touch every supply chain, every commodity market, every country that depends on Chinese demand. The world bet heavy on China's rise. Nobody has a plan for what happens when the machines that powered it start feeding on itself. The question is no longer whether China's system is under stress. That debate is settled. The real question is whether Beijing can break the loop before the loop breaks the system. Can China reinvent its fiscal architecture before local governments strip mine everything that's left? Can it rebuild private sector confidence while the enforcement apparatus still runs on survival instincts? Can it build a consumer-driven economy with a shrinking, aging population and a generation of young people who've given up looking for careers that match their degrees? Or has the machinery of growth already become the machinery of extraction, with no off switch in sight? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the stories shaping the future of global power, they don't wait for anyone.
China lied about its population, not by thousands, not by millions, by over 100 million people. That's not a typo. Beijing fabricated enough people to fill a country the size of Japan. And now the truth is collapsing faster than its skyline. At exactly 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, 15 empty skyscrapers in Kunming were leveled in a single demolition. Over 4.6 tons of explosives reduced these ghost towers to rubble, a perfect symbol of China's hollowed-out future. Because this isn't just a housing crisis, or a birth rate slump, or another economic slowdown. This is the total unmasking of a global superpower built on lies. According to the latest data from Statista in 2024, China's birth rate hit an extinction-level low, 6.77 births per 1,000 people. That's fewer babies than funerals, around 60 to 80 million empty apartments, skyrocketing youth unemployment, a shrinking workforce, an aging population with inadequate pension support. And now 70% of Chinese families have their life savings tied up in properties that are now basically worth less and less every year. Imagine waking up tomorrow and your home is worth almost half of what you paid. Now multiply that nightmare by hundreds of millions of families. For decades, the world feared China's rise. But as you'll soon see, this unstoppable juggernaut was always a mirage, a demographic Ponzi scheme on borrowed time. And the bill is finally coming due. In this video, we'll expose how China fabricated its population numbers to inflate its global power, why its workforce is imploding and taking the economy with it, and what actually happens when a supposed superpower begins rotting from the inside out. The collapse isn't coming, it's already here. Let's begin with the bombshell. China has been cooking its population books for decades. According to Professor Yi Fushan, a leading expert on Chinese demographics, the government has been overestimating its population by at least 10%. Why would they do this? Simple. Bigger population numbers made China look stronger, more productive, and more economically impressive on the world stage. China wanted to project strength, says Yi. Artificially inflated population figures made their GDP per capita look lower, their military power look greater, and their economic miracles seem more miraculous. But the truth is finally breaking through the facade. In 2022, China announced its first population decline in 60 years. But according to Yi's research published in a 2023 study cited by Newsweek, the population actually started shrinking back in 2018, 4 years earlier than officially admitted. The deception wasn't small or accidental. Internal Chinese documents leaked to Western researchers suggest that local officials were pressured to inflate population figures to meet political targets. Birth records were fabricated, deaths went unreported, ghost people populated spreadsheets and databases. Why? Because admitting population decline would mean admitting failure. But the consequences of this lie are now hitting like a tsunami. Production figures that assumed a workforce of a certain size? Wrong. Housing demand projections? Complete fantasy. Economic growth targets? built on quicksand. The impact has become increasingly hard to ignore. While Beijing continues to project confidence, setting a 2025 GDP growth target of around 5%, most international forecasts paint a more sobering picture, anticipating growth closer to 4 to 4.7%. Long-term projections are even lower, with many analysts expecting China's average growth to dip into the 3% range by the end of the decade. That growing gap between what Beijing promises and what actually happens, it's not just a red flag, it's a siren. More and more experts are calling out the cracks in China's economic fairy tale. But this deception goes far beyond just doctored spreadsheets and faked statistics. And that's where this story becomes a nightmare. Here's something you won't believe. China's birth rate is now lower than Japan's, a country notorious for its demographic crisis. Recent data from Statista shows China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, nearly 50% below replacement level. For context, a healthy society needs about 2.1 children per woman just to maintain its population. China isn't even close, and this isn't just a blip. The macro trends data paints a shocking picture. After decades of slowing growth, China's population has now entered negative territory, shrinking by 0.03% in 2024 and continuing to accelerate downward. The annual percentage change graph shows a clear, dramatic decline that demographers project will only worsen. But didn't China end its infamous one-child policy, you might ask? They did in 2016, and absolutely nothing changed. The government expected a baby boom. Instead, they got a baby bust. Young Chinese couples took a hard look at sky-high housing costs, brutal work hours, and expensive education requirements and said, no thanks. The situation is so dire that the Chinese government has implemented increasingly desperate measures to boost birth rates. In major cities like Shanghai, they've introduced baby bonuses of up to 10,000 yuan, about $1,400. They've created tax incentives for families with multiple children. They've even launched propaganda campaigns with slogans like "Marriage and reproduction are family responsibilities." None of it is working. As Bloomberg reported in early 2024, China's birth rate continued falling even after couples were allowed to have up to 3 children. But hold on, it gets even worse. According to projections from Visual Capitalist, China's population could shrink by half by 2100, dropping from 1.3 billion to around 600 million. That's losing the entire population of North America in just 75 years. The prestigious Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences put it in even starker terms in their 2023 report. China's demographic collapse is not a future event, but a present reality, moving at an accelerating pace. Think of it this way. China spent decades brutally enforcing a policy to have fewer babies. It worked so well that now, when they desperately need children, they can't convince their population to have them. A Chinese demographer who requested anonymity told the Taipei Times the one-child policy fundamentally altered the cultural understanding of family size. You can't undo that with policy changes. And this is where China's economic house of cards begins to collapse. Here's a fact that should terrify Beijing. China's working-age population peaked back in 2015 and has been shrinking ever since. Let that sink in. For nearly a decade, the engine of China's economic miracle has been losing power. According to research from China Briefing, by 2050, China will have 200 million fewer workers. That's more than the entire U.S. workforce gone. This workforce collapse is already causing severe labor shortages in key industries. Factory owners in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces report having to raise wages by 30 to 40% just to attract basic assembly line workers. That's destroying China's competitive edge as the world's low-cost manufacturer. But that's just the beginning of the nightmare. China is facing a demographic time bomb that no country has ever successfully diffused, getting old before getting rich. Right now, about 14% of China's population is over 65. But by 2040, that number will explode to nearly 30%, almost 1 in 3 people. Imagine a country with more grandparents than workers. The cost of this aging crisis is staggering. According to projections cited by Bloomberg, China faces a looming pension crisis as its rapidly aging population threatens to overwhelm the system within the next decade. Xi Jinping himself acknowledged the severity in a rare moment of candor during a 2023 closed-door meeting with Communist Party officials, reportedly saying, "The demographic situation has become the most significant hidden danger to national security." The social contract that has kept China stable for decades, rapid economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is fracturing under this demographic pressure. Who's going to staff the factories that made China the world's workshop? Who's going to buy all those empty apartments? Who's going to pay for the health care and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese? The answer is devastating. Nobody. And this demographic collapse is already causing an economic catastrophe that's becoming impossible to hide. If you've ever wondered what a $5.30 trillion real estate bubble looks like when it pops, just look at China right now. For decades, China built its economy on a simple principle: construct more apartments and people will buy them, not to live in, but as investments. The numbers are mind-blowing. Residential real estate makes up nearly 70% of household wealth in China, compared to just 34% in the United States. When housing prices fall in China, they don't just hurt homeowners, they wipe out entire family fortunes. And falling they are. According to Bloomberg data, Chinese housing prices have dropped for 36 consecutive months as of early 2024. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed under the weight of more than $300 billion in debt. The domino effect is staggering. Country Garden, once China's largest developer, defaulted on $11 billion in overseas debt in October 2023. Shimao Group, another giant, fell in January 2024. At least 50 major Chinese developers have now defaulted on their debts. These aren't just corporate bankruptcies, they're existential threats to the Chinese middle class. Millions of Chinese families have paid in full for apartments that will never be completed. Their life savings have vanished into concrete foundations that will never support actual homes. The protests have already begun. In over 100 cities across China, homebuyers have launched mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans on unfinished properties. Social media footage, quickly censored but impossible to completely suppress, shows crowds chanting, "Return our money," outside bank headquarters. And scattered across the country, ghost cities and vacant apartments as far as the eye can see. Entire metropolitan areas built for millions of residents stand virtually empty. The Yuzhapa Financial District in Tianjin, once touted as China's answer to Manhattan, remains largely vacant years after construction. According to Newsweek, despite its full skyline of office towers, wide boulevards, and dedicated subway station, it never attracted the residents and businesses it was designed for. Between 60 and 80 million empty apartments stand vacant across China. That's enough housing to accommodate the combined populations of the United Kingdom and Sweden. One apartment for every single citizen of both countries combined, all just sitting empty, collecting dust, and losing value by the day. But here's where things go completely off the rails. Here's a number that should keep you up at night: 300%. That's the approaching debt-to-GDP ratio in China when you combine borrowing by government, households, and corporations, according to the Wall Street Journal. What makes this even more alarming is the massive hidden borrowing by local governments through opaque investment vehicles. On some measures, China's debt burden is now more severe than what the U.S. faced before the 2008 financial crisis, or what Europe experienced during its debt crisis a decade ago. The Chinese economic miracle wasn't built on innovation or productivity. It was built on debt. Mountains of it. Every time growth slowed, the government ordered more construction, more apartments nobody would live in, more infrastructure nobody needed, more factories with no orders, all to keep the GDP numbers up and maintain the illusion of unstoppable economic progress. Former Chinese Finance Minister Liu Jiwei openly acknowledged the problem in a rare, candid speech at Tsinghua University in 2023. Our economic growth has been primarily driven by investment, not by productivity or innovation. This model has reached its limits. And who funded this house of cards? Local governments. These regional authorities across China collectively owe over $9 trillion in debt. For years, they've relied on selling land to developers as their primary source of income. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue has dried up completely. Some local government finances are so precarious that they've resorted to bizarre measures to raise cash. The city of Nanning tried to sell police cars. Tianjin auctioned off government furniture. Henan province attempted to force civil servants to buy unsold apartments from struggling developers. The results are catastrophic. According to recent reports from Economic Times, some cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of supplies. In Henan province, government workers have seen their paychecks cut in half. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. Chinese banking expert Michael Pettis from Peking University notes, the debt situation at local levels is far worse than what's officially reported. Many liabilities are kept off the books through local government financing vehicles, which operate as hidden debt mechanisms. The debt problem is so severe that the central government had to take emergency action in January 2024, allowing local governments to swap high-interest debt for lower-interest bonds backed by Beijing. But this just shuffles the problem around. It doesn't solve the fundamental issue that the debt can never be repaid without continued growth that's no longer possible. This isn't some future crisis. It's happening right now. And right alongside this debt catastrophe comes another shocking development that proves how far China's economy has already rotted. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21% in 2023, so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers, according to Pew Research data. That's just the official figure. According to Business Insider, independent analysts have estimated the real rate could be as high as 46.5% when accounting for underemployment and those who've simply given up looking for work entirely. Think about that. Nearly half of China's young people can't find proper work in what's supposed to be the world's economic powerhouse. The situation became so politically sensitive that in July 2023, China's National Bureau of Statistics simply announced it would suspend reporting youth unemployment figures while it improved its methodology. Translation: the numbers were too damning to share publicly. College graduates are calling themselves full-time children, moving back in with the parents after failing to find jobs. Others talk about lying flat, giving up on career ambitions entirely in a system that seems rigged against them. A 25-year-old from Shanghai told CNN, "I spent 4 years getting an engineering degree. Now I deliver food on an electric scooter. My parents spent their life savings on my education for nothing." These aren't just statistics. They're tens of millions of educated, ambitious young people with nothing to do and no hope for the future. Throughout history, that's been the most explosive social combination possible. The desperation is fueling a new social phenomenon in China: involution, a culture of fierce, pointless competition for dwindling opportunities. Young Chinese describe spending 16-hour days studying for civil service exams, where 1.5 million applicants compete for just 37,000 government jobs. The odds of success? About 2%. Meanwhile, the factories that once provided endless jobs are shutting down or moving elsewhere. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India. Nike and Adidas have relocated much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. But these corporate moves are just the beginning of a much larger economic divorce. According to World Trade Organization forecasts, Chinese exports to the United States are expected to collapse by a staggering 77% in 2025, an unprecedented disruption to global trade patterns that will reverberate through both economies. The days of China as the world's factory are ending, says economist Damien Ma of the Paulson Institute. It's a structural shift accelerated by geopolitical tensions but fundamentally driven by China's own demographic and economic challenges. And as manufacturing flees, it reveals an even darker truth beneath the surface. What's truly terrifying about China's economic rot is that it's not just about money and jobs. The country is literally running out of the most fundamental resource of all: 90% of China's groundwater is polluted, according to environmental data from Our World Data. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, now runs dry for months each year. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces water shortages so severe that experts question whether the region will remain habitable. China's water crisis is the most severe and complex in human history, says Dr. Zhang Jinfeng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The scale of the problem affects hundreds of millions of people and threatens the foundation of our industrial capacity. The statistics are apocalyptic. More than 400 Chinese cities suffer from permanent water shortages. Over 700 million people drink water contaminated with human or animal waste. In Beijing, the water table has dropped nearly 1,000 feet since the 1970s. The government's solution? The South to North Water Diversion Project, the largest water diversion project in world history, costing over $62 billion. But even this mega project can only address about 5% of northern China's water deficit. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. No amount of economic policy or government intervention can create water where there is none. And let's not forget, this is a country that can't even feed itself. Despite having 20% of the world's population, China has just 7% of its arable land and imports 80% of its soybeans and huge quantities of other foods. A startling fact, China has less farmland per capita than Saudi Arabia. Think about that. A desert kingdom has 37.5% more arable land per person than the supposed agricultural powerhouse of Asia. The fragility of China's food supply was demonstrated dramatically during COVID lockdowns when residents of Shanghai, China's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city, faced food shortages so severe that people were bartering luxury goods for basic groceries. A nation with a shrinking population, polluted water, dependence on imported food, and an economy built on lies is a nation on the brink of collapse. But what happens in China won't stay in China. You might be thinking, why should I care about China's problems? Because when the world's second largest economy and the manufacturing hub for everything from iPhones to antibiotics starts unraveling, the shockwaves will hit every corner of the globe. Global supply chains will collapse, price inflation will spike, financial markets will crash as Chinese investors pull out to cover domestic losses. China's economic problems represent the single largest threat to global economic stability today, warns former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. The interconnections between China's economy and the rest of the world run deeper than most people realize. Consider this: China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It controls 85% of global rare earth processing, critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. It manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels and 76% of its lithium-ion batteries. If China's economy crashes, the cascade effects would be unprecedented. Commodities markets would collapse overnight as Chinese demand evaporates. Australia's mining industry, Brazil's agricultural exports, and Germany's luxury car sales would all suffer devastating blows. Even more concerning is what happens to the $784 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds held by China. If Chinese authorities needed to liquidate these holdings to manage domestic economic crises, American borrowing costs could spike overnight. But that's not even the most dangerous part of this unfolding disaster. What keeps military strategists up at night is Beijing's need for distraction. As China's internal problems mount, its external aggression has reached alarming levels. Military analysts have documented increasing naval activity in the South China Sea and a significant rise in military flights into Taiwan's air defense zone. The rhetoric from top officials has shifted from talk of peaceful reunification to increasingly aggressive posturing. It's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. When the economy collapses, find an enemy to blame. When citizens start questioning their government, give them a foreign threat to fear instead. But here's what's truly terrifying. History shows that when authoritarian regimes face internal crises, they often look for external enemies to blame. China's increasing military aggression, territorial claims, and threats against Taiwan aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the desperate actions of a regime that knows its economic miracle is turning into a nightmare. There's a direct correlation between China's internal economic economic stress and its external belligerents, explains Dr. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution. The more pressure the Communist Party faces at home, the more it needs a foreign adversary to distract its population. And unlike previous global powers in decline, China has nuclear weapons, the world's largest military force with 2.035 million active personnel and a leadership structure that fears losing control more than anything else. The truth about China's population lie isn't just reshaping one country, it's rewriting the future of the entire world. The truth is undeniable. The China we've been told to fear was built on deception, not just propaganda aimed at the outside world, but a fundamental misrepresentation of its own economic and demographic reality. What we're witnessing is not just another downturn in a business cycle, it's the unraveling of the greatest economic mirage in modern history. Former Chinese Premier Li Keqiang inadvertently revealed this in a private conversation leaked to foreign diplomats, saying China's official GDP statistics were man-made and for reference only. He personally relied on electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending as more reliable indicators of China's true economic condition. By those measures, China's economy is already in deep trouble. The reality is that China's economic miracle ended years ago, says Dr. Michael Beckley of Tufts University. What we're seeing now is the lag between economic reality and global perception. China isn't rising. It's already rotting from within. Empty apartments worth trillions sitting vacant. Ghost cities built for millions with no residents. A workforce that's been shrinking for nearly a decade. Local governments so broke they're paying workers with groceries instead of money. The social instability this creates is Beijing's worst nightmare. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests almost entirely on delivering economic prosperity. When that vanishes, what's left? Xi Jinping seems to know the answer, which explains China's massive investment in surveillance and security technology. The regime now spends more on internal security than on its military, a telling statistic about what truly frightens Chinese leadership. This isn't some distant future threat. The collapse is happening right now, in real time, and the consequences will reshape our world. So what do you think? Is China's decline inevitable, or can Beijing somehow turn things around? And how will the truth about China's population lie affect global markets and security in the next decade? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real. Or click this other video instead. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos that expose the shocking realities behind today's biggest global stories. Thanks for watching.
The year is 2035. China's gleaming skyscrapers are half empty. Its ghost cities, once symbols of unstoppable growth, are crumbling. And that massive middle class that was supposed to power China's future, they're watching their savings disappear as property values collapse. Sounds crazy, right? After all, this is China we're talking about, the economic miracle that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the country that built entire cities in months and became the world's factory floor. But here's the thing, China's miracle is running out of magic, and what's happening now isn't just a slowdown, it's the beginning of something much worse. We're watching the world's second largest economy start a long, painful slide back into poverty. Don't believe it? Let me show you why China's future looks a lot more like its past than anyone wants to admit. Let's start with something that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. China's real estate market, worth a staggering $50 trillion, is imploding. We're not talking about a minor correction here. This is a full-blown crisis that's erasing decades of wealth creation. Think about this. China has enough empty apartments to house 3 billion people. That's not a typo. 3 billion. Remember, China's total population is only 1.4 billion. They've literally built enough homes to house an extra China, and then some. But here's where it gets really wild. Meet Zhang Wei, a 35-year-old software engineer from Shenzhen. Back in 2020, he and his wife spent their life savings on a $400,000 apartment. They thought it was a safe investment, and after all, Chinese property values had only gone up for decades. Now, that apartment's worth half what they paid. And they're not alone. Across China, middle-class families are watching their wealth evaporate. The numbers are staggering. In just the past 2 years, Chinese property prices have dropped by 30% in some cities. In places like Dongguan, once a booming tech hub, entire neighborhoods sit empty. Local real estate agents say they haven't made a sale in months. Remember Evergrande? It used to be China's biggest property developer. Now it's defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. But here's the scary part. Evergrande isn't the only one. Country Garden, another massive developer, just defaulted on $187 billion. Together, China's property developers owe more money than the entire GDP of France. And it's not just the big developers. The whole system is built on a house of cards. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate, compared to just 35% in the United States. When property values fall, they don't just lose a little money, they lose everything. But the real estate crisis isn't just about money, it's about trust. See, Chinese developers had this crazy business model. They'd sell apartments before they were built, using the money from new buyers to finish projects for old buyers. It worked great as long as prices kept rising. But now, there are over 20 million pre-sold apartments that might never get finished. Imagine saving for years, finally buying your dream home, and then nothing. The construction stops, the developer disappears, your life savings are gone. That's happening to millions of Chinese families right now. And here's the kicker. Local governments are in on this too. They've been funding themselves by selling land to developers. With the property market frozen, their revenue has collapsed. Some cities have cut civil servant salaries. Others can't afford to maintain basic services. But that's just the beginning of China's problems. Because while everyone's been focused on those empty apartments, something even more dangerous has been happening. China's been losing its edge as the world's factory floor. Wait until you hear what's happening to China's manufacturing sector and why companies are racing to move their factories to places like Vietnam and Mexico. But first, we need to talk about the man who's accelerating China's decline and how this obsession with control is strangling the world's second largest economy. Meet Xi Jinping, the leader who's managed to do what decades of Western sanctions couldn't: cripple China's economic future. And he's done it in ways that would make Mao proud. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had the freedom to experiment with policies. Foreign investors were welcomed with open arms, and China's government mostly stayed out of private business. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed all that. Since taking power, he's rewired China's entire economy around a single principle: control. And I mean control of everything. Take Jack Ma, for example. He built Alibaba into China's Amazon and was worth over $800 billion. Then he made one speech criticizing financial regulators. What happened next? His company's IPO got canceled overnight. Regulators launched investigations, and he basically disappeared for months. Alibaba's value? It dropped by $400 billion. That's more than the entire value of Walmart, gone because one businessman spoke out of turn. And it gets worse. In 2023, Xi introduced an anti-espionage law so broad that even basic market research could get you arrested. Want to know how many gadgets a factory produces? Could be espionage. Want to survey Chinese consumers about their shopping habits? Might be a national security threat. The results were predictable. Foreign companies started pulling out. In 2023 alone, foreign investment in China dropped by 80%. Just let that sink in. Businesses would rather give up on the world's biggest market than deal with Xi's rules. But here's where Xi's really outdone himself. He's concentrated so much power in his own hands that even China's central bank needs his approval for major decisions. Remember how local officials used to have freedom to experiment? Now they're so scared of making mistakes that they won't make any decisions at all. This might sound like just political stuff, but it's having real economic impacts. Let me show you what I mean. In 2023, China reported 5.2% GDP growth. Look at this chart from the World Economic Forum. See how they're projecting growth to slow even further? But even these numbers don't tell the whole story. The government celebrated their 5.2% like it was proof their system was working. Western media outlets ran headlines about China's robust recovery. Even the IMF praised China's strong comeback. But here's what they're not telling you. China had to invest 40% of its entire GDP, twice what the US invests, just to get that growth. The numbers are brutal. China dumps $40 into the economy just to get $100 of growth. That's not an economy, that's a money pit. Want to see how crazy this gets? Let's look at just one example, high-speed rail. China's built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail lines, more than every other country in the world combined. Sounds impressive, right? But here's the catch. 80% of these lines lose money. The railway system's total debt? $900 billion. Some lines generate so little revenue they can't even afford their electricity bills. Or take the city of Tianjin. They spent $47 billion to build a world-class financial center. Today, most of the buildings are empty. The few companies that moved in are mostly state-owned enterprises forced to be there. It's like building a massive shopping mall in the middle of nowhere and then forcing government stores to open there. This isn't just happening in one city. Across China, local governments have built airports that never see planes, stadiums that never host games, and museums that never open. They're building stuff just to boost GDP numbers. Youth unemployment got so bad that China stopped publishing the numbers. It got so bad they just stopped releasing the numbers altogether. And remember those tech companies we talked about? The ones Xi cracked down on? In 2021 alone, his policies destroyed more value than the entire GDP of France. Hundreds of thousands of high-paying tech jobs vanished. Some of China's brightest minds, the people who were supposed to drive innovation and future growth, are now driving delivery bikes or selling street food. Here's why this matters. China's old model of growth, building stuff and exporting cheap goods, isn't working anymore. They need to shift to a consumer-driven economy like every other developed nation. But Xi's policies are doing the exact opposite. He's scaring away investors, crushing private business, and making it harder for regular Chinese people to make money. But if you think that's bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's local governments. Because while Beijing might be putting on a brave face, China's provinces are facing a financial crisis that makes America's 2008 meltdown look like a minor hiccup. Here's the thing about China's local governments. They've been running a giant pyramid scheme for decades. They'd buy land cheap from farmers, sell it expensive to developers, and use that money to fund everything from schools to subways. In good times, land sales provided up to 40% of their revenue. But remember those property developers we talked about? The ones going bankrupt? Well, they're not buying land anymore. And when nobody's buying land, local governments stop making money. It's that simple. Let me show you how bad this has gotten. In Henan province, civil servants had their salaries cut by 50%. In Guangdong, China's richest province, government workers are being forced to take pay cuts of up to 30%. Some cities can't even afford to keep their streetlights on at night. Take the city of Tianjin again. They're so desperate for money, they're selling off government buildings. The local government literally can't afford its own offices anymore. And they're one of the wealthy cities. Imagine how bad things are in poorer regions. But here's where it gets really scary. Chinese local governments have racked up $9 trillion in hidden debt. That's bigger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. They used something called local government financing vehicles, basically special companies that could borrow money without it showing up on official books. Now these LGFVs, as they're called, are starting to default. In 2023, a financing vehicle in Yunnan province missed a payment on its bonds. It was the first default of its kind in China's history, but it won't be the last. Remember those basic services governments are supposed to provide? Schools, hospitals, road maintenance? Local governments are cutting back on all of that. And it's creating a dangerous feedback loop. When local governments cut spending, people lose jobs. When people lose jobs, they stop buying houses. When nobody buys houses, property prices fall more. When property prices fall, local governments make even less money from land sales, and round we go. But here's the real kicker. China's central government can't just bail everyone out. They've got their own problems. Between COVID spending, military buildups, and trying to prop up the economy, Beijing's coffers aren't as full as they used to be. You might be thinking, okay, but China still makes everything, right? They're still the world's factory floor? Well, about that. Because what's happening in China's manufacturing sector might be the biggest sign yet that China's heading back to poverty. Remember when Made in China was on everything you owned? Those days are ending. Let me show you why. Take Apple. They've been making iPhones in China since 2007. But in 2023, something remarkable happened. They started moving production to India. Not just a little bit either. By 2025, 25% of all iPhones will be made in India. That's a $50 billion shift away from China. And Apple isn't alone. Samsung, they've already left, moving their factories to Vietnam. Nike, they're making more shoes in Vietnam than China now. Even Chinese companies are getting out. BYD, China's biggest electric car maker, is building factories in Mexico and Thailand. The numbers are staggering. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have tripled since 2018. Mexico's manufacturing sector is growing at its fastest rate in decades. Meanwhile, China's share of global exports has dropped for the first time in 40 years. But why is this happening? Well, it's not just one thing, it's a perfect storm. First, Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Average factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A factory worker in Vietnam cost half as much. In India, it's even less. Remember how China got rich by being the world's low-cost manufacturer? That advantage is gone. Second, Xi's policies have scared companies away. Remember that anti-espionage law we talked about? Well, imagine trying to run a factory when checking your own production numbers might be considered spying. Companies are tired of dealing with it. Third, China's population is aging fast. The number of working-age people in China has dropped by 40 million since 2012. That's like losing the entire workforce of Spain. And it's getting worse. China's workforce is shrinking by 3 million people every year. But here's what really keeps manufacturing executives up at night: the growing tension between China and the West. Companies learned a hard lesson during COVID. Depending too much on China is risky. Now, with talk of trade wars and sanctions, they're not taking chances. Look at what happened to China's semiconductor industry. In 2022, the U.S. banned the sale of advanced chip-making equipment to China. Overnight, China's plans to dominate the semiconductor industry were set back by years. Their most advanced chips are now 3 generations behind Taiwan's. The impact on Chinese workers has been devastating. In Dongguan, once known as the world's factory, thousands of factories have closed. The city's population has dropped by 10% as workers leave to find jobs elsewhere. Similar stories are playing out across China's manufacturing belt. And this isn't just about factory jobs. It's about the entire ecosystem of businesses that grew up around manufacturing. The restaurants that fed workers, the shops that sold them goods, the apartments they rented, all of that is starting to collapse. But if you think this manufacturing exodus is bad, wait until you hear about China's demographic nightmare. Because while factories can move back someday, China's population problem is about to make poverty inevitable. And when I say inevitable, I mean it's already happening. Here's a number that should terrify Xi Jinping. For every 17 people who die in China today, only 10 babies are being born. China's population isn't just shrinking, it's collapsing. In 2023 alone, China lost 2 million people. That's like losing the entire population of Slovenia in just 1 year. But it gets worse, much worse. By 2035, that's just 11 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That means 400 million elderly people who need pensions, healthcare, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But wait, you might be thinking, don't they have young people to support the elderly? Well, that's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean catastrophic. Remember that one-child policy China had for decades? Well, they're paying the price now. A typical family structure in China looks like this: 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and just 1 child. They call them 4-to-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. And those young people, they're struggling. Let me show you something fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean terrifying. This graph tells the story better than I ever could. See that sharp line going up? That's China's urban youth unemployment rate. It hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2023, and then the line just stops. Why? Because China simply stopped publishing the numbers. They claimed they needed to improve their statistical methodology. Right, more like they needed to figure out how to make terrible numbers look less terrible. Independent estimates suggest the real rate is now closer to 30%. Even after they resumed reporting with their new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped to 14.9%. But here's the thing, they changed who counts as unemployed youth. Convenient, isn't it? Take Lu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate in Shanghai. He's been looking for work for 8 months. His parents spent their savings on his education, hoping he'd support them in retirement. Instead, he's delivering food on an electric scooter, making barely enough to support himself. China's pension system is already cracking under the pressure. In 2022, 14 provinces reported pension shortfalls. By 2035, China's pension system will need an extra $300 billion every year just to stay afloat. That's more than China's entire military budget. But here's where demography becomes destiny. Remember how China got rich? Cheap labor. Lots of young workers willing to work in factories for low wages. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree. Today, it's 4. By 2035, it'll be 2. That's not an economy that can support itself, let alone compete globally. And China can't immigrate its way out of this problem. Unlike America, which can attract talented people from around the world, China's strict controls and growing xenophobia make it an unattractive destination for immigrants. Instead, China's losing its best and brightest. In 2023, applications for emigration hit record highs. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. It's a brain drain and a capital drain happening at the same time. Think this is just a future problem? Think again. Because what's happening to China's social contract right now might be the biggest sign yet that poverty isn't just coming. It's already here. See, China's government had a deal with its people. It went something like this: give up political freedom, get economic prosperity in return. For 40 years, the deal worked. People got richer, lives got better, everyone was happy, or at least happy enough. But now, that deal is falling apart faster than a Chinese apartment building. Remember Zhang Wei, our software engineer from earlier? His parents lived through real poverty in the 1970s. They accepted authoritarian rule because their lives kept improving. Zhang accepted it because he thought he'd do even better than his parents. Instead, he's watching his property value collapse. His tech sector job is insecure. His savings are worth less every day as the yuan weakens. And now he's wondering, what exactly is he giving up his freedom for? He's not alone. Across China, people are asking the same question. Young people call it lying flat, giving up on the rat race because they can't win anyway. They're refusing to buy homes, have kids, or work overtime. Some are even refusing to work at all. The numbers tell the story. China's manufacturing output is shrinking. Foreign investment is fleeing. The property market is in free fall. And consumer confidence? It's hit historic lows. Marriage rates have plunged 60% in the last decade. Birth rates have collapsed. People aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. And Xi Jinping knows it. That's why he's doubling down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with a political one. the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. You can't live in it. You can't save it for retirement. This is how China becomes poor again. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Property values fall. Factories leave. Young people give up. Old people run out of savings. Local governments can't provide services. The middle class disappears. It's already happening. In 2023, the number of Chinese billionaires dropped by more than half. The middle class is shrinking for the first time since reforms began. Rural parents are pulling kids out of school because they can't afford tuition. This isn't just a crisis, it's the end of an era. The Chinese miracle is over. The economic model that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, it's broken, and there's no fixing it. Think about what that means for a second. The world's second largest economy, home to 1.4 billion people, is sliding back into poverty. Not because of war, not because of natural disasters, but because the very things that made China rich are now making it poor. The real estate bubble that created wealth is now destroying it. The demographic dividend that powered growth has turned into a demographic disaster. The authoritarian system that enabled rapid development is now strangling innovation. So what happens next? Well, that's where things get really interesting and scary. Because China's not going to get poor alone. When the world's second largest economy tanks, everyone feels it. Those supply chains you rely on, they're going to break. The cheap stuff at Walmart, it's going to get expensive. Those treasury bonds China owns, they might have to sell them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world.
A strong China is predictable. It grows, it builds, it competes. A collapsing China is something else entirely. Because when a country this large starts to struggle, it doesn't just slow down. It looks for ways to regain control, to restore strength, to change the narrative. And that is where things get dangerous. Because systems under pressure don't act rationally. They take risks they normally wouldn't. They make moves the world isn't ready for. And right now, China is entering that phase. The most unstable moments in history don't come from rising powers. They come from powers that feel like they're losing their grip. For the better part of 3 decades, the world structured itself around a single assumption. China was going to keep rising. Not gradually, not cautiously, permanently, powerfully, and without meaningful interruption. And honestly, there was plenty of reason to believe it. After the reforms of the late 20th century, China became the manufacturing engine of the modern world. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in a generation. Skylines that didn't exist in 1990 became some of the largest cities on Earth by 2010. Supply chains, trade routes, shipping networks, all of it rebuilt around the expectation that Chinese growth was the new gravity of the global economy. The world didn't just adapt to China's rise, it bet on it, heavily, and for decades. Banks invested in it, governments built trade policy around it, corporations relocated entire production lines to take advantage of it. By the 2010s, China was contributing nearly a third of all global economic growth. Entire national development strategies in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America were designed around Chinese demand for resources, Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, and Chinese appetite for commodities. The IMF, the World Bank, every major forecasting institution on Earth, all of them had some version of the same long-term outlook. The Chinese economy continues to expand, and the world continues to adapt around it. That is how deeply the assumption ran. But here's what nobody tells you about how a bet that big, when the underlying assumption shifts, everything built on top of it shifts too. And the assumption is shifting. Today in 2026, China is not the unstoppable machine the world planned for. Growth is still happening, officially. Beijing hit its 5% target in 2025, but underneath that headline number, something more troubling is taking shape. Quarterly growth decelerated through the year, finishing at just 4.5% in the final quarter, the weakest since early 2023. And the growth target Beijing set for 2026, it's the lowest target announced since the early 1990s. Meanwhile, independent analysts at the Rhodium Group estimate actual growth may be running below 3% when you strip out methodology. China is slowing, not collapsing, but slowing, and slowing in ways that matter enormously. The property sector, once the engine inside the engine, is still in deep crisis. Since China's housing market peaked in 2021, prices have fallen 20 to 40%. Not 5, not 10%, but between 20 and 40%. 77 property developers have defaulted on their debts since 2020. Evergrande, one of the world's most valuable real estate brands, was ordered into liquidation in January of 2024 and officially delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in August of 2025. Country Garden, another giant, is still struggling to survive. Thousands of apartment buildings sit half-finished across the country, bought and paid for by ordinary Chinese families who are still waiting for homes that may never be completed. Now, this matters far beyond the real estate industry. In China, property wasn't just a place to live. It was the primary store of household wealth, the backbone of local government revenue, and one of the largest contributors to economic output. At its peak, the sector and everything connected to it accounted for roughly a quarter of the entire economy. When it broke, it didn't just hurt homeowners. It hollowed out municipal budgets, froze construction, and punched a hole in consumer confidence that Beijing is still struggling to repair. Local governments in 12 high-debt provinces, including Tianjin, Guizhou, and Yunnan, have been flagged by authorities as carrying elevated fiscal risk, their finances increasingly dependent on central government transfers rather than the land revenues that they used to count on. And then there's deflation. While the rest of the world spent the last 3 years fighting rising prices, China has been experiencing the opposite. The GDP deflator, a broad measure of price changes across the entire economy, has been negative for 3 consecutive years. Consumer prices averaged 0 inflation throughout 2025. Now, on the surface, falling prices sound like a good thing, but in reality, deflation is a trap. Businesses delay investment because things will be cheaper tomorrow. Consumers hold back spending for the exact same reason. Debt becomes heavier in real terms. The World Bank flagged this explicitly in December of 2025, calling it a balance sheet recession, a warning that deflationary pressures are expected to persist. The economy is going to start eating itself from the inside. But the economy is only one crack. The population problem is something else entirely. China's demographic collapse is not a future threat. It's happening now, in real time, faster than almost any demographer predicted. In 2025, China's population fell for the 4th consecutive year. The country recorded just 7.92 million births, the lowest number since the People's Republic was founded in 1949. For context, in 2016, China recorded nearly 18 million births. So in less than a decade, that number has been cut in half. The birth rate has now fallen to 5.63 births per 1,000 people. And marriages, the leading indicator for future births, have plunged by a 5th in 2024, the biggest single-year drop on record. At the other end of the age curve, 323 million Chinese citizens are now aged 60 or older, making up 23% of the total population. The United Nations projects China could lose more than half its population by the end of the century. That's not a rounding error. That is the effective hollowing out of an entire civilization's demographic foundation. And the working age population is already shrinking, with the 16 to 59 cohort falling to just 60.6% of the total in 2025. There's a structural concept in Chinese demography known as the 4-2-1 family structure: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child, with that single child expected to carry the financial and caregiving weight of the entire extended family. That model, which the one-child policy baked into an entire generation, creates enormous dependency pressure precisely when the state most needs social stability. It concentrates risk into the smallest possible household unit, at exactly the moment the pension system is under strain and healthcare costs are rising. And the generation caught in the middle, young Chinese who were supposed to power the next phase of growth, are disengaging. Youth unemployment for those aged 16 to 24 hit 18.9% as of mid-2025. And that's just the official figure. The data methodology was overhauled after the numbers first reached above 20% in 2023, because they were becoming a political problem. In parallel, a cultural movement called lying flat, tangping in Mandarin, has spread across Chinese social media, a deliberate, quiet refusal to participate in the competitive grind of a system that no longer seems to deliver what it once promised. The state has tried everything to reverse this: cash incentives for births, propaganda campaigns about family values, subsidies amounting to what Reuters estimates could reach 180 billion yuan in 2026. None of it has meaningfully moved the needle, because the underlying logic driving young Chinese to disengage is economic, not cultural. The numbers don't add up, and they know it. China's pension system is already feeling the weight of all this. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has warned that the National Pension Fund faces serious long-term stress. More than 300 million people aged 60 and over are now drawing on a system that was designed around a very different age structure. The working age population is shrinking. The retired population is growing. And the middle, the cohort that was supposed to bridge the gap, is the generation choosing to not have children. That is not a cycle that fixes itself quickly. In fact, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, China's birth collapse since 2016 is nearly unheard of outside of active wartime. What we are watching is a peacetime demographic contraction moving at wartime speed. Individually, these are serious problems. Together, they create something that has no quick fix: a shrinking workforce, a surging elderly population, pension funds running dry, local governments without revenue, and a leadership in Beijing that must maintain the appearance of total control while watching the pillars of its legitimacy quietly erode. And when a system this large starts feeling trapped, something changes at the top. This is where most coverage misses the real story. Xi Jinping's system is not designed for retreat. It is designed for forward motion, for delivering growth, demonstrating strength, maintaining the political legitimacy that comes from an economy that always moves upward. When growth was strong, the party could absorb criticism, tolerate risk, project calm. But a leadership under economic pressure operates with a very different set of constraints. And the choices Beijing is making reveal exactly what kind of pressure it's under. In recent years, the state has moved aggressively to tighten its grip on private enterprise. Alibaba was hit with a 2.8 billion antitrust fine in 2021. Ant Group's IPO, which would have been the largest in history, was killed days before launch in 2020. The entire for-profit tutoring industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars, was effectively banned overnight in 2021. A mechanism called golden shares, small equity stakes granting special oversight rights, has quietly been inserted into major private companies in media, technology, and data. The message to entrepreneurs and foreign investors is consistent: you operate on the party's terms, or you face the consequences. The result is a chilling effect on exactly the kind of risk-taking that drives long-term innovation. You cannot mandate the informal culture that produces world-changing platforms and technologies. And as the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment remains effectively frozen, killed by political confrontation, Beijing finds itself increasingly diplomatically isolated at precisely the moment it needs economic partners most. The wolf warrior style of Chinese diplomacy that became dominant under Xi has now shown in peer review research to harden negative perceptions abroad rather than improve them. China is cornering itself. And as economic legitimacy fades, the party leans harder on the one tool that doesn't require GDP growth to function: nationalism, historical grievance, external threats, the idea that China is encircled by hostile forces, and that strength, not compromise, is the only answer. When nationalism becomes the substitute currency of power, internal problems have a tendency to stop staying internal. Hey, if this breakdown is useful, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next is where the internal pressure starts turning into something the entire world has to prepare for. Here's the piece that political scientists have been warning about for years and that mainstream coverage constantly underplays. There is a well-established body of research on what happens to major powers when they peak. Not when they collapse, but when they peak. When growth slows, strategic windows narrow, and leadership looks ahead and sees less room to maneuver than before. Researchers Michael Beckley and Hal Brands, writing in International Security, describe these peaking powers, and they argue that historically, such states have been among the most dangerous actors in the international system. Not because they are weak, because they are still strong enough to cause enormous damage, but increasingly uncertain whether that strength will last. That uncertainty changes the calculus on risk dramatically. The logic runs like this. A rising power that believes time is on its side can afford patience. It waits, it accumulates, it positions. A peaking power sees the opposite, a closing window. And leaders who feel a window closing have historically been willing to take risks that calmer, more confident governments would reject. Apply that logic to China today, and one flashpoint dominates everything else: Taiwan. China's military activity around Taiwan has exploded. According to a new report from Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, Department of China Affairs, there were 5,709 sorties by the People's Liberation Army in 2025, up from just 380 in 2020. That is a 50-fold increase in a single half-decade. China has conducted large-scale naval drills explicitly simulating blockade operations, surrounding the island with warships in exercises that make little effort to disguise their intent. Military officials have begun publicly discussing blockade scenarios as the policy option. The PLA has deployed carrier task groups to waters near Okinawa, signaling clearly to Japan the cost of intervening in any Taiwan scenario. And in 2025, academic research published in Telecommunications Policy concluded that Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain would be particularly vulnerable to a Chinese quarantine before 2027, meaning the danger window is not theoretical, it's now. This is not background noise. This is a deliberate, sustained, escalating campaign being run by a leadership that cannot afford for it to look like anything other than strength. And the reason Taiwan sits at the center of China's strategic calculus is not just about politics, it's about technology. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Every AI system, military platform, smartphone, data center, and modern vehicle depends on output from those facilities. Every major technology company on Earth, Apple, Nvidia, Qualcomm, they all depend on TSMC. And TSMC's core operations sit on an island 100 miles off China's coast that Beijing considers an unfinished historical question. Bloomberg Economics estimates that a blockade of Taiwan alone, not even a full invasion, would cost the global economy $5 trillion in the first year. That is larger than the entire GDP of Japan. It would simultaneously shut down chip production for cars, aircraft, weapon systems, and consumer electronics in every major economy. Not for months, but for years, because there was no spare capacity anywhere else in the world capable of absorbing that volume. And here is the part that makes China's strategic clock feel very real. TSMC is currently building overseas fabrication plants in Arizona, Japan, and Germany. So within a few years, those facilities will meaningfully reduce the world's exclusive dependence on Taiwan. The window of maximum strategic leverage is open now. Research published in the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs in 2025 noted this directly, that TSMC's value in Taiwan is at its peak, and that the longer Beijing waits, the less exclusive that leverage becomes. A leadership that needs an external demonstration of strength, a nationalist narrative that demands historical resolution, a strategic asset whose leverage diminishes each passing year. We have seen this combination before. Germany in 1914 did not go to war because it was confident of victory. German military planners watched Russia's industrial strength expanding and concluded that delay could mean certain disadvantage. They saw a closing window and chose to act before it was shut. The result was catastrophic for everyone, including Germany. Japan in 1941 did not attack Pearl Harbor from a position of strength. Japan attacked because its leaders calculated that U.S. oil restrictions meant slow economic strangulation on a longer timeline. A desperate gamble over a certain slow loss. Again, catastrophe, including for Japan. Neither country expected to win a long war. Both acted because they believed waiting was worse than moving. The pressure of perceived decline collapsed the space for rational caution. That is the historical pattern, and the conditions that have produced it are present in China today, simultaneously. This is not a prediction of war. It's an honest look at what the conditions are, and those conditions are certainly not stable. Now, here is the uncomfortable truth that almost no one in mainstream policy circles want to say clearly. A stable, cooperative China is one of the most valuable things in the global economy. A hostile, cornered China is dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. But a genuinely chaotic China, a China experiencing real internal breakdown, will become the worst outcome of all. Supply chains that the world has spent 5 years trying to de-risk from, but hasn't. Financial markets still deeply exposed to Chinese debt and demand. A nuclear-armed state in internal crisis. Regional neighbors with no clear framework to respond. The shocks would propagate through the global system in ways nothing in modern economic history has produced. The paradox of where we are today is almost too uncomfortable to sit with. External pressure of China, through tariffs, export controls, diplomatic isolation, constrains its options. But the more constrained these options become, the more pressure builds on a leadership that cannot admit weakness, cannot reverse course publicly, and cannot afford to be seen as losing. That pressure has to go somewhere, and the only question is where. There is no clean answer. The world cannot simply encourage China to open up. Beijing's political system is moving in the opposite direction. It cannot simply isolate China. The entanglement runs too deep in supply chains, financial markets, and sovereign debt across the developing world. And it cannot simply wait and hope the internal pressures resolve peacefully, because patience is exactly the quality that peaking power dynamics tend to erode first, on both sides. The world spent decades building trade relationships, financial institutions, and security frameworks designed for a rising China. Almost none of that architecture was built for what we are actually watching. A great power that still possesses enormous capacity, that is growing more nationalist rather than more open, and that increasingly feels the clock ticking down on a future it once believed was guaranteed. That is not a stable condition. And if history has anything useful to say on this, it's this. When a great power starts to feel like it's running out of time, the world rarely gets to choose whether it's ready. So here's what we want to know. If the world largely got China's rise right, and it still found it deeply disruptive, what happens when it gets China's decline mostly wrong? And what does a world that hasn't planned for this actually do when the pressure finally finds a release? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely want to hear your take. And if you want to stay ahead of stories that actually matter, the ones under the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We'll see you in the next one. China's worst decade in 500 years doesn't begin with tanks. It begins with empty apartments, with local governments quietly running out of cash, with young people refusing to buy homes, with debt piling up faster than growth can hide it. For decades, the world has told one story. China only goes up. But right now, the pillars that held up that rise are cracking, all at once. Property, which once made up roughly a quarter of the economy, local governments drowning in hidden obligations, a population aging faster than it can replace itself, a generation that no longer believes that tomorrow will be richer than today. This isn't a normal slowdown, it's a convergence. And when a system built on endless growth suddenly runs out of momentum, history suggests that the fall isn't gentle. This is how China's worst decade in 5,000 years will begin. China's modern rise can be told as a story of concrete, urbanization at breakneck speed, entire skylines rewritten in a decade, infrastructure as national muscle, and at the center of it all, housing. Not just as shelter, but as the financial architecture underneath everything. Research by economists Kenneth Rogoff and Yaoshen Yang estimated that real estate and its related sectors made up roughly 1/4 of China's entire GDP in recent years. That's an extraordinary share for any major economy. And at its peak, the total value of China's housing stock was estimated at more than double that of the United States. But here's the part that turns a property slump into a full-blown national crisis. Housing wasn't just an industry in China, it was a national savings account. A 2019 People's Bank of China survey found that for urban households, housing made up nearly 70% of total assets. Independent academic research using China Family Panel Studies data confirmed the same picture. Housing accounted for roughly 3/4 of all household wealth in the early 2010s. When an entire society stores its future in one asset class, a price decline, it's not just a financial event, it's a psychological earthquake. Spending freezes, confidence collapses, people stop buying, they stop investing, stop believing. And that shift doesn't reverse quickly, because the loss isn't just financial, it's personal. It's a family that spent 20 years saving for a home and now watches the value drop month after month. It's a retiree whose entire net worth was supposed to be in that apartment. The system that created this problem relies on a very specific pipeline. Developers finance construction through pre-sales. Families handed over their life savings for apartments that hadn't been built yet. Local governments controlled the land and sold usage rights. Banks and shadow lenders provided the credit. Rising prices kept the whole machine spinning. Land revenue funded infrastructure. Infrastructure boosted land values. Higher land values attracted more buyers. Now, for years, it looked like perpetual motion. But perpetual motion doesn't exist in economics. And when the machine stalled, it stalled hard. In 2024, sales by the top 100 real estate developers dropped by more than 28%. Housing prices in lower-tier cities entered steep correction. Real estate investment posted its largest annual decline since 2004. Through mid-2025, the World Bank documented a further 6.4% contraction in property prices. And the bleeding, it hasn't stopped. Across the country, academic researchers have documented high vacancy rates in smaller cities, using the term ghost cities to describe places where housing was built years ahead of any demand. Entire districts sit empty. New apartment towers with no lights on at night. Shopping malls with no shoppers. Now, these aren't outliers. They're symptoms of a system that kept building long after the need had peaked. Bloomberg reported that in late 2025, Beijing actually began censoring social media posts about the housing market, scrubbing content that was deemed too negative about prices and policy. When a government starts silencing discussion of a crisis, the crisis is usually worse than what they were admitting. The big names tell part of the story. Evergrande, once China's largest developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. In August of 2025, it was formally delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, its shares effectively worthless. China Vanke, a developer once seen as a safe bet because of its government connections, posted a record $6.8 billion loss for 2024. Over 60 developers have either defaulted on offshore debt or entered restructuring negotiations. And the human cost behind the corporate headlines is enormous. Tens of millions of Chinese families paid upfront for apartments through that pre-sale system. Homes that were never completed. Construction stopped. Developers disappeared. Life savings gone. This wasn't just construction. It was belief poured into concrete. And the damage doesn't stop with developers and home buyers. Industries downstream from real estate, we're talking cement, steel, furniture, home renovation, elevators, are all under severe strain. For private business owners in these sectors, the downturn, it hasn't just been painful, it's been existential. And when that belief cracked, it didn't stay in housing. It bled straight into the fiscal system holding the entire country together. Because here's what most people don't realize. China's property collapse is also a government funding collapse. And what's happening underneath is even more alarming than what's visible on the surface. After China's 1994 tax-sharing reforms, a structural gap opened up. The central government kept the major tax instruments. Local governments got stuck with the heavy spending obligations. Schools, hospitals, roads, metros, salaries, public services. The OECD described how this left local governments with large responsibilities but limited tax autonomy. That gap didn't close. It got filled by land. Local governments would acquire land cheaply. They'd convert it and then sell land use rights to developers at a markup. The revenue funded nearly everything. Academic research documented that official land sales revenue exceeded 55 trillion yuan between 2007 and 2020. In certain peak years, land-related income made up close to 40% of local government budgets. The whole system ran on a single assumption: land prices will only go up. When property markets cooled, land auctions collapsed, and local fiscal capacity dropped almost overnight. The Reserve Bank of Australia published detailed research showing that land sales revenue, historically the most important source of local government income, contracted sharply in the early 2020s. And what filled the gap was worse. Local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, state-owned entities that are created to borrow and invest on behalf of local governments, especially when formal borrowing was restricted. Now, after the 2008 global stimulus, LGFVs expanded rapidly, becoming central conduits for local investment and evolving into complex corporate platforms with diversified holdings. By 2023, the IMF estimated that LGFV debt had reached roughly 48% of China's entire GDP, around $9 trillion. But even the IMF treats that figure as a floor. The true burden could be significantly larger, because much of this debt is opaque, off-balance sheet, and nearly impossible to price accurately. On a cash basis and without government subsidies, UBS analysis found that only 19% of LGFVs can actually service their interest payments. The rest are surviving on implicit guarantees and accounting maneuvers. What happens when local governments can't meet their obligations? In open markets, you get defaults and restructuring, visible, legal, priced. In China, you get something quieter, in many ways more corrosive. Delayed contractor payments, frozen construction projects, civil servant salary cuts of 30 to 50% across multiple provinces. In Hainan, one of China's most populous provinces, government workers saw their pay slashed in half. In Guangdong, China's richest province, even public employees took significant cuts. Cities that can't keep their streetlights on, municipalities selling off government buildings because they can't afford the upkeep, airports that never see planes, stadiums that don't host games. It's not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding squeeze that erodes public trust from the ground up. And in several provinces, interest expenses on local debt now exceed 10% of revenues, meaning that these governments are borrowing just to stay afloat, not to grow. China's leadership is now attempting one of the most dangerous balancing acts in modern economic history. You shrink the property sector to a sustainable size without crashing the banking system, restructure local government debt without triggering cascading defaults, maintain social stability while cutting the very spending that keeps communities running. Now, each of these goals collides with the others, and the margin for error gets thinner by the quarter. But here's what makes this decade truly different from any slowdown that China has faced before. Debt can be restructured, property can eventually stabilize, stimulus can buy time, but you can't negotiate with demography. Hey, if you're following this and you want more deep dives into how global powers really rise and fall, be sure to hit subscribe, because what comes next may be the most destabilizing shift of all. In 2025, China recorded just 7.92 million births, a 17% plunge from the year before, and the lowest number since records began in 1949. Deaths outpaced births by more than 3.39 million. China's population shrank for the fourth consecutive year, falling to 1.405 billion. To put that in perspective, China's annual births have dropped to a level comparable to 1738, when the country's total population was roughly 150 million. The birth rate fell to 5.63 per 1,000 people, which is the lowest on record since the founding of the People's Republic. Today, 323 million Chinese citizens are over the age of 60. That's 23% of the entire population, and it jumped a full percentage point in just 1 year. The working age population keeps contracting, 851 million in 2025, down nearly 7 million from the year before. The UN estimates China's fertility rate has plummeted to about 1.0, less than half the 2.1 needed just to maintain a stable population. The long-range projection is staggering. China's 1.4 billion people could shrink to 633 million by 2100, nearly halved in a single lifetime. The government has thrown everything at this crisis. Cash bonuses for families with young children, free public preschool, streamlined marriage registration, mandates requiring hospitals to offer pain relief through childbirth. They even taxed condoms, removing contraceptives from a tax exemption list and slapping a 13% levy on birth control starting in January of 2025. President Xi has openly urged women to embrace what he calls a new type of marriage and childbearing culture. But none of this has reversed the trend. Researchers say it won't, because once women gain reproductive freedom, no government incentive reliably reverses that choice. The number of women aged 20 to 34 responsible for 85% of births is projected to drop from 105 million in 2025 to just 58 million by 2050. That math simply doesn't allow a recovery. And the consequences are already landing. A typical family structure in China now looks like this: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. They call them 4-2-1 families. That 1 child is expected to support 6 older people. It's a mathematical impossibility that's becoming a lived reality for hundreds of millions. China's pension system is already under severe strain. Multiple provinces have reported shortfalls, and the ratio, it keeps worsening. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree, and today it's closer to 4. By the mid-2030s, it could be 2. That's not an economy that can sustain itself, let alone compete globally. And there's a layer that almost nobody discusses. China still carries the long shadow of its one-child policy, not just in birth rates, but in gender imbalance. The 2020 census reported a sex ratio at birth of 111.3 males per 100 females. That number has improved since earlier decades, but the cumulative legacy is a massive cohort of men facing what researchers call a marriage squeeze. Peer-reviewed research published in the Review of Economics and Statistics found a statistically significant link between skewed sex ratios and rising crime among young adults. And the effect intensifies when paired with unemployment, low social status, and limited mobility. In a high-growth era, the state could absorb the pressure through jobs, migration, and rising wages. In a low-growth era, with official youth unemployment around 16%, but independent analysts estimating closer to 46%, well, that pressure becomes dangerously exposed. Only 6.1 million couples married in 2024. That's a record low, down dramatically from the 13 million marriages recorded just a decade earlier. Young Chinese have a word for that withdrawal: lying flat. Refusing to compete, refusing to buy, refusing to reproduce. It started as internet slang, but now it's the subject of peer-reviewed academic journals, framed as passive resistance to a system that no longer delivers on its promises. Some call it a quiet rebellion. Others call it surrender. Either way, it means fewer workers, fewer consumers, and fewer families. Exactly the opposite of what China needs. A system built on momentum is now powered by hesitation. But demographics don't explode overnight. They corrode something quieter and more dangerous: confidence. Modern economies run on belief. When households believe housing will hold value, they buy. When entrepreneurs believe that rules will stay stable, they invest. When local governments believe that they can refinance, they build. But you break that belief, and behavior changes quickly. Money will hide, hiring freezes, families postpone children. A national mood of caution becomes self-reinforcing. The evidence is piling up. The Rhodium Group, an independent research firm, estimated China's actual GDP growth in both 2024 and 2025 at between 2.5 and 3%, roughly half of the official 5% figure. The gap was significant enough that even the U.S. Federal Reserve independently analyzed whether Chinese statistics were overstated. That alone tells you how deep the credibility questions are running. Now, peer-reviewed research also has documented a measurable decline in trust in local governments. This follows the extended pandemic lockdowns, which were a sign that performance failures leave lasting marks even in systems with tight control. When people feel that the government has mishandled a crisis, the skepticism doesn't vanish when the crisis ends. It lingers, and it shapes how they respond to the next set of promises. In 2025, Fitch Ratings downgraded China from A+ to A, citing rising public debt and an eroding revenue base. Consumer prices barely moved. The CPI rose just 0.2% in 2024, a sign of persistent deflationary pressure that stimulus has struggled to reverse. Nominal GDP growth fell below real GDP growth, a rare and telling signal of economy-wide deflation driven by weak domestic demand. Households are saving more and spending less. Retail spending, while technically positive, masks a reality of cautious consumers who simply aren't willing to commit. And when China's National Bureau of Statistics revised its youth unemployment methodology, excluding students from the count and redefining who qualifies as, quote, seeking work, it didn't ease anxiety, it deepened it. Because in a society already nervous about jobs and housing, changing how you measure the problem doesn't change the problem itself. Trust doesn't require proof to fracture, it only requires doubt. And doubt is spreading. When belief breaks inside an authoritarian system, the pressure doesn't dissipate outward. It moves upward, toward the center. When systems enter structural stress, the decisive question isn't whether leaders are smart or determined, it's whether the menu of viable choices remains wide enough to navigate the crisis without making it worse. China's menu is narrowing fast. The IMF has warned that a deeper than expected property contraction combined with high debt could trigger adverse macro-financial feedback loops, the classic post-bubble trap. Stimulate too much and debt balloons further. Stimulate too little, and the downturn deepens. Force a rapid cleanup, and financial stress accelerates. Every option has a price. Prominent scholars like Susan Shirk at UC San Diego have argued that China has shifted back toward personalistic rule under Xi Jinping. With weakened succession norms, tighter concentration of power, and diminished internal debate, that matters because authoritarian regimes rarely fall from popular uprising. They fracture from within, through elite splits. Institutionalized succession reduces that risk. Personalized rule amplifies it. And when economic performance falters, elite cohesion becomes both more critical and harder to sustain. The external environment is turning hostile too. Trade tensions with the United States intensified through 2025. Tariffs returned, technology restrictions tightened, and the global mood shifted toward what the IMF calls fragmentation pressure. China posted a record $1.2 trillion trade surplus in 2025. But that surplus increasingly depends on an export machine that major trading partners are actively pushing back against. And so the vicious triangle tightens. Slowdown leads to tighter control. Tighter control suppresses private sector dynamism. Less dynamism makes recovery harder, which demands even more control. Round and round it goes. None of this means collapse is inevitable. China still retains enormous strengths, a massive industrial base, deep state capacity, vast savings reserves, and the ability to mobilize resources at a scale that few countries can match. In the optimistic scenario, the state accepts slower growth. It restructures local finances, lets failed developers exit, expands social protection, and builds trust through transparency. Property becomes a smaller sector, not a systemic threat. But the pessimistic scenario is just as plausible and far more dangerous. The system tries to preserve the old growth model with new debt. It keeps insolvent firms alive, suppresses bad news rather than fixing the causes, relies increasingly on coercion to manage discontent. In that world, the cracks deepen, local governments cut harder, youth disengage further, households save more and spend less, and elite politics grows more anxious as the circle of trust starts to narrow. So what does that next decade actually look like? Not famine, not civil war. China has endured eras in which tens of millions have perished, empires have fractured, and warlords have fought over ruined provinces. The claim that this could be the worst decade in 5,000 years, it's not about bloodshed on that scale. It's about convergence. A modern, globally integrated superpower, home to 1.4 billion people, woven into every supply chain, commodity market, and shipping lane on Earth, facing simultaneous stress in property, debt, demography, trust, and governance, all while the global environment grows less forgiving. All the while, the room to absorb shocks keeps shrinking. And the stakes aren't only Chinese. When the world's second largest economy stalls, the tremors reach everywhere. Commodity markets, industrial supply chains, currency systems, bond markets, and the climate trajectory of the entire planet. A prolonged period of Chinese weakness, it won't be a regional event. It would be systemic. China's dynastic history taught a lesson that modern economics restate in a different language. When fiscal capacity weakens, when legitimacy becomes contested, and when crises arrive faster than institutions can adapt, stability turns fragile. Empires rarely fall in a single year. They weaken when too many pillars crack at the same time. And for China, that decade starts now. So what do you think? Is this just a rough patch or the beginning of something that the world isn't ready for? Drop your take in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the forces shaping the global order, they're not slowing down.
100 million people didn't just vanish, they were never there. For years, China boasted the numbers: more workers, more babies, more growth, a nation too big to fail. But behind the curtain, the truth was rotting. A fake population, crumbling cities, empty apartments, and an economic model built on ghosts. Now the lie is collapsing in real time, and Beijing is scrambling to control the fallout. Youth joblessness is exploding, ghost cities are multiplying, entire provinces are running out of cash, and the government? Too scared to publish the real numbers. The dragon isn't just wounded, it's hollow. And when it finally breaks, the shockwaves will hit the whole world. Let's expose how China faked its future and why it's now crumbling faster than anyone expected. At exactly 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, the sky over Kunming filled with dust and thunder. 15 skyscrapers, modern towers of glass and steel, collapsed in a single coordinated blast. 4.6 metric tons of explosives turned them to rubble in seconds. But these weren't condemned relics from some forgotten era. They were brand new, built for a population that never showed up. They had stood unfinished and uninhabited for years. Concrete tombstones marking a future that was never coming. That demolition wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning shot. According to Dr. Yi Fujian, a leading demographer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, China's government has overcounted its population by at least 100 million people. That's more than the entire population of Japan or Egypt or the Philippines, existing only on paper. Phantom citizens, statistical ghosts, fabricated for political theater. Yi's research reveals something chilling. Local officials didn't just estimate wrong, they invented data. Between 1991 and 2000, the government claimed 203 million births across China. But follow-up census found only 164 million people were actually born. Nearly 40 million citizens were conjured from nothing. Ghost entries in government databases, names without faces, lives that never happened. The fraud wasn't random, it was systematic, and it ran deep. Local cadres faced crushing pressure to hit population quotas. Central government funding flowed to provinces based partly on headcounts. More people on paper meant more money from Beijing. So officials fabricated birth records, buried death certificates, and padded numbers year after year. The lies compounded. The databases swelled with phantom citizens. Beijing looked the other way because the illusion served them too. Why? Because population equals power. A larger population made China's aggregate GDP look bigger on the world stage. It made the potential military conscription pool seem more fearsome. It enhanced the economic miracle narrative that attracted trillions in foreign investment. The whole China story, the factories, the skylines, the unstoppable rise, was propped up by citizens who didn't exist. And now, reality is catching up with the brutal, merciless speed. In 2022, China officially admitted its first population decline in 60 years. The first since the catastrophic famine that killed tens of millions in the early 1960s. But Yi Fujian's data suggests the decline actually began around 2018, years before Beijing acknowledged anything. While officials were still claiming marginal growth, the population was already shrinking in the shadows. Think about what this means. Every national plan was built on sand. Factories were expanded for workers who didn't exist. Cities were constructed for families who were never born. Schools were built for children who never arrived. Pension systems and healthcare budgets assumed taxpayers who weren't there to pay. The entire architecture of modern China rests on a foundation of fabricated numbers. The GDP growth targets which Beijing confidently projected, turning to dust. The World Bank now forecasts China's growth will slow to 4.9% in 2025 and 4.4% by 2026. By decade's end, many economists expect it to crater into the low single digits. The era of double-digit Chinese expansion is dead, and the gap between what Beijing promises and what actually happens is widening into a chasm. But here's where it gets worse. Because this isn't just a numbers game, it's a slow-motion catastrophe already hitting Chinese families where it hurts. If you want to see what an economy built on ghosts actually looks like, take a drive through any of China's ghost cities. Ujiapu Financial District in Tianjin was supposed to be China's Manhattan. Gleaming office towers, world-class infrastructure, billions invested. A decade later, it's a mausoleum. Buildings stand empty, streets stretch for miles without a pedestrian. Streetlights illuminate nothing but concrete and absence. This isn't an isolated failure. By some estimates, China now has between 65 and 80 million empty apartments. Enough housing to shelter the populations of the United Kingdom and Sweden combined. Entire districts of unsold units gathering dust. Entire skylines where only a handful of windows glow at night. Cities built for millions, inhabited by hundreds. Here's where the terror really sets in. About 70% of Chinese household wealth is locked up in real estate. 70%. In the United States, that figure is closer to 35%. Chinese families bet everything, their savings, their futures, their children's futures on property. And those property values have been falling for 36 consecutive months. 3 straight years of bleeding with no floor in sight. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover your home is worth half of what you paid. Now multiply that nightmare by hundreds of millions of families. That's not a hypothetical, that's China right now. The carnage among developers defies belief. Evergrande, once China's second largest developer, collapsed under more than $300 billion in liabilities. One of the largest debt failures in history. Country Garden, the nation's top developer by sales, defaulted on $11 billion in offshore bonds. Shimeo, Sunac, Fantasia, Kaisa. At least 50 major developers have defaulted since 2021. It's not a correction, it's an extinction event. Each default isn't just a line item on a balance sheet. It's millions of families watching their life savings evaporate before their eyes. Evergrande alone pre-sold apartments to more than 1.5 million customers, families who handed over their savings for homes that may never be completed. Across China, middle-class couples paid everything they had for units and projects now frozen as half-built skeletons of rebar and concrete. In 2022, desperate homebuyers in more than 100 cities staged an unprecedented mortgage boycott, refusing to keep paying for apartments that didn't exist. Footage leaked of crowds massing outside banks, faces twisted with rage and despair, chanting, "Give us our homes!" The video spread for hours before censors scrubbed them from the internet. The human wreckage is staggering. People who did everything right, worked brutal hours for decades, saved every yuan, invested exactly as they were told, have watched their wealth vanish overnight. Young couples who scraped together down payments by borrowing from parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents now owe money on apartments that may never be built. Elderly retirees who sank their life savings into investment properties for income now clutch worthless deeds to empty shells. The social contract that held China together for decades, rising prosperity in exchange for political obedience, is fracturing. That bargain depended on one unspoken promise: tomorrow will always be better than today. But when homes lose value year after year, when jobs evaporate, when the future looks bleaker than the past, that promise shatters, and with it, something fundamental breaks in the relationship between the people and the party. The property collapse sends shockwaves through every layer of the economy. Local governments, which depend heavily on selling land to developers for revenue, are drowning in debt. Land sales have dried up. Tax income has cratered. Some cities have resorted to auctioning off officials' luxury vehicles and furniture just to keep the lights on. In several provinces, civil servants have watched their salaries slashed by 30 to 50%. Reports emerged of government workers being paid in bags of rice and cooking oil because local treasuries were empty. Hospitals in poorer regions couldn't afford basic medical supplies, and health budgets went bankrupt. And it's still accelerating. Home prices keep falling. Consumer confidence is collapsing. Families watching their biggest asset bleed value have slammed their wallets shut. They're not spending on cars or vacations or appliances anymore. They're hoarding cash and bracing for worse. It's a vicious cycle feeding on itself, spiraling towards something far darker. But the economic wreckage is only part of their story. Because behind the collapsing numbers, an entire generation is being erased from the future. In mid-2023, China's official youth unemployment rate hit 21.3%, the highest ever recorded. That's double the rate in the United States. Young people lining up outside job fairs that have nothing to offer. College graduates clutching diplomas that mean nothing in a market with no openings. And then, without warning, the government stopped publishing the data. The National Bureau of Statistics announced it would suspend youth unemployment figures to refine the methodology. Translation: the numbers had become too humiliating to show the world. A spokesman later hinted they might exclude college students entirely from future counts. anything to make the statistics less catastrophic. Of course, hiding data doesn't make the crisis disappear. Independent economists estimate the real unemployment or underemployment rate for young Chinese is closer to 46.5%, nearly half the generation, when you count those who've given up looking or are trapped in dead-end gig work. A Peking University professor named Zhang Dadan published that estimate. Her report was censored and scrubbed from the internet within days, which tells you everything about how close to the truth it was. China now churns out roughly 11 million new college graduates every year. The economy can't absorb them. Many end up delivering food on scooters or driving ride-hailing apps, positions miles below their qualifications. A bitter term has gone viral: full-time children, educated adults forced to move back in with their parents because they cannot find work. They're not launching careers, they're not starting families, they're waiting for a future that keeps receding. The despair runs deeper. Changping, lying flat, has swept through Chinese youth culture. It means opting out entirely, rejecting the 996 grind for minimal effort, minimal consumption, minimal ambition. Another phrase, Beilan, let it rot, stop trying. The system is rigged, so why play? These aren't internet jokes, they're acts of quiet rebellion from a generation that sees no path forward. This year, a record 2.8 million people sat for China's National Civil Service exam, competing for just 37,000 government positions. That's roughly 76 applicants per seat. Some postings saw odds worse than 1,000 to 1. Why the frenzy? Because in an economy hemorrhaging private sector jobs, a government position is one of the last stable options remaining. The Iron Rice Bowl is back, not as a symbol of prosperity, but as a life raft in a sinking economy. Meanwhile, China's working-age population has been shrinking since 2015. For nearly a decade, more people have been leaving the workforce than entering it. By 2050, projections show more than 200 million fewer workers than 2020, a decline of nearly a quarter. That's like losing the entire American labor force, plus tens of millions more. Factories in the export powerhouses of Guangdong and Zhejiang have already reported severe labor shortages. Some have raised wages 30 to 40% just to attract entry-level workers, destroying the cheap labor advantage that made China the world's factory floor. Companies that can't find or afford workers are packing up and leaving for Vietnam, India, Mexico. The exodus is accelerating. And as the workforce vanishes, so does the engine that powered China's rise. But what if that rise was never what it appeared to be? What if the miracle was always a mirage? Yi Fujian's research shows that China's censuses have been systematically inflated since the 1990s. Local officials fabricated birth records to extract more funding from Beijing. The central government weaponized those inflated figures to project power on the global stage. The motive was coldly simple: bigger population equals a bigger GDP. Larger military potential, more international clout. It didn't matter if it was real, it only mattered that the world believed it. Now look at the birth rate collapse tearing through the country. In 2024, China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people, even lower than aging Japan, and roughly half the rate needed to maintain a stable population. The nation that once feared overpopulation now can't pay, persuade, or propagandize its citizens into having children. The one-child policy enforced with brutal efficiency from 1980 to 2015 permanently rewired Chinese society. Even after Beijing lifted restrictions to allow 2 children, then 3, births kept plummeting. There was no rebound. None. Young couples looked at skyrocketing housing costs, crushing work hours, and the astronomical expense of raising a child through China's hyper-competitive education system, and chose to have fewer children or none at all. A survey by China's Communist Youth League found 44% of urban young women don't plan to marry. No marriage often means no children. The demographic pipeline has run dry. The government has thrown everything at the problem. Cash bonuses equivalent to $1,400 for newborns in some cities. Tax breaks, propaganda campaigns urging that having children is a family responsibility. Nothing works. Births hit record lows even as restrictions loosened. The projections are apocalyptic. Some forecasts suggest China's population could shrink by half before the century ends, from 1.4 billion to somewhere between 600 and 700 million. This isn't a distant threat on some far horizon. It's happening now, accelerating with each passing year. By 2035, China will have over 400 million senior citizens, more elderly than the entire population of the United States. The Chinese Academy of Sciences warns the national pension system could run completely dry by then. Healthcare infrastructure is unprepared. Social safety nets are threadbare. China is growing old before it ever got rich, and it's wrestling with another crisis: resources. China holds 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. Up to 90% of groundwater in major cities is polluted. The water table beneath Beijing has dropped nearly 1,000 feet. Vast regions face shortages that could make them barely habitable within decades. A shrinking population might ease some of that pressure. Fewer mouths to feed, less demand on aquifers. But economic contraction makes everything harder. Less tax revenue for environmental cleanup, less investment in infrastructure, less capacity to adapt. The problems don't disappear, they compound. The whole system was built assuming a workforce and consumer base that was never as large as Beijing claimed. This wasn't incompetence, it was just theater. Carefully staged, meticulously maintained, ruthlessly protected. But the curtain is finally falling, and now Beijing's greatest fear isn't foreign enemies, it's the truth. Here's what the party doesn't want you to see: it's not just hiding economic data, they're erasing reality itself. When youth unemployment became too embarrassing to publish, the authorities stopped reporting it. When mortgage protests erupted across 100 cities, censors scrubbed the footage within hours. When economists published inconvenient findings, their research vanished. The pattern is consistent. Any data contradicting the official narrative gets buried. In 2022, a hacker calling himself China Dan breached the Shanghai Public Security Bureau's database and extracted records on approximately 970 million people. He posted samples and offered the full data set on the dark web. Security researchers verified the phone numbers and ID information were real, actual Chinese citizens in an actual government database. The implication is explosive. If that database represents China's national registry, and analysts believe it does, since police networks are interconnected across the country, then the official population of 1.4 billion is a fantasy. The leaked data suggests a number closer to 1 billion. Even mundane statistics tell a damning story. Between 2015 and 2019, China produced roughly 66 million tons of raw salt annually. By 2022, that figure dropped below 50 million tons, a decline of roughly 25%. Salt consumption is nearly impossible to fake. Everyone needs it, rich and poor alike. You can't stockpile it like gold. If production collapsed because fewer people were consuming it, the population implications are staggering. The government's response to mounting evidence? Not transparency, not reform. More control, more silence. China now spends more on internal security, including police, surveillance cameras, facial recognition, riot control, than on its military. The party fears its own people more than any foreign enemy. Whistleblowers face prison, journalists face harassment. The silence isn't natural, it's manufactured. But data doesn't vanish just because it's hidden, and neither does reality. Eventually, the weight of truth becomes too heavy to suppress. And when China's collapse accelerates, don't think you'll be watching from a safe distance. The fallout won't stay within China's borders. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It dominates global exports of electronics, machinery, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and countless other products that fill your home, your office, your hospital. If Chinese factories falter or exports nosedive, supply chains worldwide seize up overnight. We got a preview during COVID lockdowns, shortages of auto parts, iPhone components, medical supplies, production lines halted, shelves emptied. Now imagine that disruption sustained indefinitely, not from a virus, but from economic implosion. The financial exposure cuts deep. Chinese investors have poured capital into assets worldwide: Vancouver condos, London towers, Wall Street equities. If a domestic crisis forces them to repatriate, asset prices globally could crater. China holds around $800 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. If Beijing started dumping them out of desperation or as a weapon, it could spike American interest rates and send shockwaves through every market on the planet. Then there's the stranglehold on critical supplies. China processes about 85% of the world's rare earth elements. The metals inside your smartphone, your electric car, your guided missiles. It produces over 80% of global solar panels and roughly 75% of lithium-ion batteries. It manufactures the ingredients for antibiotics and countless other pharmaceuticals. A disorderly Chinese contraction wouldn't just raise prices, it could cause critical shortages. Hospitals rationing antibiotics, factories unable to source components, green energy transitions grinding to a halt. The modern economy is wired through China in ways most people never see until something breaks. Australia rode a China-fueled commodities boom for 2 decades. If Chinese construction collapses, Australian mines face ruin. Brazil exports mountains of iron ore and soybeans to Chinese buyers. A downturn devastates Brazilian farmers and miners. Germany sells millions of luxury cars to Chinese consumers. Evaporating demand hammers German automakers. Every continent has deep economic arteries running to China's appetite. A Chinese collapse isn't like North Korea crumbling, isolated, contained, a regional problem. It's more like the entire European Union melting down at once. The shock would ripple everywhere. The recovery would take a decade or more. And there's a darker possibility. Declining powers can be more dangerous than rising ones. When domestic legitimacy crumbles, authoritarian regimes manufacture foreign crises to redirect public rage. Rally around the flag, blame the enemy abroad. Chinese fighter jets are already harassing U.S. aircraft over the South China Sea. Warplanes buzz Taiwan's air defense zone in record numbers. Xi Jinping's rhetoric on reunification grows more urgent by the month. Nationalism is the party's emergency pressure valve. If Beijing feels cornered, the temptation to manufacture a confrontation could prove overwhelming. And unlike the Soviet Union, which collapsed peacefully, China possesses a vast modern military and a growing nuclear arsenal. When China sneezes, the world catches a cold. Right now, China isn't sneezing, it's hemorrhaging, and the blood is starting to spread. Here's the truth no one in power wants to admit. The unstoppable dragon was always a mirage. A population inflated by 100 million ghosts. An economy propped up by a property bubble now collapsing in real time. A generation with no jobs, no prospects, no faith in the future. Hundreds of millions of elderly facing pensions that may not exist. Local governments so broke they're paying workers in rice. And a regime so terrified of the truth that it has chosen to censor reality itself rather than confront it. For decades, China projected invincibility through spectacle, glittering skylines, high-speed rail networks, military parades, economic growth rates that defied gravity. They weren't defying gravity, they were fabrications dressed up as miracles. The bill is coming due. The demographic collapse is irreversible. You cannot will babies into existence. The debt is unsustainable, estimated at roughly 300% of GDP when you count government, corporate, and household obligations combined. The deception is unraveling faster than any propaganda machine can patch it. And when the system finally cracks, when the hollow dragon finally breaks apart, the shockwaves won't stay contained within China's borders. They'll ripple through global supply chains, crash through financial markets, and destabilize geopolitics for decades to come. This is what happens when data becomes propaganda, when governments manufacture reality instead of confronting it, when entire nations are built on foundations of sand, wishful thinking, and statistical fraud. 100 million didn't just vanish, they never existed. And now, the lie that hid them is crumbling before the world's eyes. The ghost cities stand empty. The pension funds are draining. The young have no jobs. The old have no one. And the government that promised endless prosperity can't even publish the truth about unemployment. Is China's decline inevitable? Can Beijing defuse this time bomb? Or has the damage already been done, baked into decades of fraud and debt? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this video opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Because the dragon's rise was the defining story of the early 21st century, its fall may define what comes next. Stay informed, stay watching.
China's economy isn't just pathetic, it's collapsing, fast, loud, and in full view of the world. The unstoppable superpower we were told would dominate the 21st century, it's crumbling from the inside out. Ghost cities, sky-high youth unemployment, a shrinking, aging population, and now a housing market so broken that over 90 million homes sit completely empty, enough to house the entire population of Spain. This isn't a slowdown, it's the spectacular unraveling of a $52 trillion inventory bubble, built not on value but on debt, hype, and deception. At 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, 15 high-rise towers in Kunming were reduced to rubble in a perfectly synchronized explosion. No war, no natural disaster, just buildings no one ever needed, collapsing under the weight of their own uselessness. It wasn't just a demolition, it was a preview. So how did China go from economic miracle to real estate graveyard? First up, the bubble that changed everything. China's real estate sector accounts for nearly 30% of its entire GDP, according to the International Monetary Fund's 2023 country report. Almost a third of their economy is tied to building apartments and commercial properties. But here's where things get alarming. Housing prices have plummeted since 2019 with no bottom in sight, according to Reuters data. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden have collapsed under hundreds of billions in debt. Unlike Americans who invest in stocks or retirement funds, about 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property, according to a 2023 survey by China's National Bureau of Statistics. When housing prices fall, families don't just lose investments, they lose everything. In cities like Shaoguan, entire districts sit half-finished and eerily uninhabited, a stark symbol of China's unraveling real estate crisis. This isn't just a correction, it's a $133 trillion property market cracking under its own weight. The property crisis has sparked unprecedented resistance. In over 100 cities, homebuyers have launched mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans on unfinished properties. Social media footage shows crowds chanting "Return our money" outside bank headquarters. And this public discontent coincides with the shocking revelation that undermines China's entire economic narrative. China lied about its population, not by thousands of millions, but by over 130 million people. According to Professor Yi Fushuan, a leading expert on Chinese demographics, the government has been overestimating its population by at least 10%. That's the equivalent of inventing an entire country the size of Japan. Why? Because bigger population numbers made China look stronger and more productive on the global stage. It artificially lowered their GDP per capita while making their military power appear greater. China wanted to project strength, says Yi. Artificially inflated population figures made their economic miracle seem more miraculous. The truth is now emerging. In 2022, China announced its first population decline in 60 years. But according to Yi's research, the decline actually began in 2018, 4 years earlier than officially admitted. What's worse, China's birth rate has now fallen below Japan's, a country famously struggling with demographic decline. Recent data from Statista shows China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, nearly 50% below replacement level. But wait, didn't China end its infamous one-child policy years ago? They did in 2016, but the expected baby boom never materialized. Young Chinese couples looked at sky-high housing costs, brutal work hours, and expensive education requirements and simply said, no thanks. The government's desperate measures, from baby bonuses of up to 10,000 won to propaganda campaigns with slogans like marriage and reproduction are family responsibilities, have failed to reverse the trend. According to projections from Visual Capitalist, China's population could shrink by half by 2100, dropping from 1.41 billion to around 600 million. That's equivalent to losing the entire population of North America. The Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences put it bluntly in their 2023 report: China's demographic collapse is not a future event but a present reality. This isn't just a statistical curiosity, it's an economic death sentence. The irony is brutal. China spent decades enforcing a policy to have fewer babies, and it worked so well that now, even when they're begging citizens to have children, nobody's listening. As one Chinese demographer told the Taipei Times, the one-child policy fundamentally altered the cultural understanding of family size. You can't undo that with policy changes. China's working-age population peaked in 2015 and has been shrinking for nearly a decade. By 2050, China will have 200 million fewer workers, more than the entire U.S. workforce. This workforce collapse is creating labor shortages that undermine China's competitive advantage. Factory owners in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces report raising wages by 30 to 40% just to attract workers, destroying China's edge as a low-cost manufacturer. The demographic crisis creates a perfect storm. China is getting old before getting rich. Currently, about 14% of China's population is over 65. By 2040, that will nearly double to 30%, almost 1 in 3 people. A country with more grandparents than workers faces an impossible economic equation. According to a 2023 report from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, China's main pension fund will run out of money by 2035. Xi Jinping himself acknowledged this in a rare moment of candor, reportedly calling the demographic situation the most significant hidden danger to national security. The social contract that has kept China stable, rapid economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is breaking down. Who will staff the factories, buy the apartments, or pay for the health care and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese? As if the property collapse and demographic crisis weren't enough, China's economic model faces a third existential threat: debt. China's overall debt has now surged past 300% of GDP, according to 2024 figures reported by the Economic Times. For comparison, the United States, hardly a model of fiscal restraint, hovers around 120%. The economic growth that impressed the world wasn't built on innovation or productivity. It was built on borrowing. Every time growth slowed, the government ordered more construction, more apartments nobody would live in, more infrastructure nobody needed, more factories with no orders. Former Chinese Finance Minister Liu Jiwei acknowledged this reality in a speech at Tsinghua University. Our economic growth has been primarily driven by investment, not by productivity or innovation. This model has reached its limits. Local governments are the canaries in this coal mine. Collectively owing over $9 trillion in debt, they've relied on selling land to developers as their primary revenue source. With the real estate market collapsing, that revenue has disappeared. The desperation is palpable. The city of Nanning sold police cars. Tianjin auctioned government furniture. Hainan province tried forcing civil servants to buy unsold apartments. According to Economic Times, some cities can't pay salaries, while others are paying workers in groceries instead of money. Banking expert Michael Pettis from Peking University notes, the debt situation at local levels is far worse than officially reported. Many liabilities are kept off the books through local government financing vehicles. The debt crisis coincides with record youth unemployment that Beijing can no longer hide. Youth unemployment hit 21.3% in June 2023, a figure so alarming that China's National Bureau of Statistics suspended reporting it while they improved their methodology. When reporting resumed, the rate still hovered at 18.8% in August 2024 before dropping slightly to 17.6% in September. That's 1 in 5 young Chinese unable to find work in what was supposed to be the world's economic powerhouse. College graduates are calling themselves full-time children, moving back in with their parents. Others describe lying flat, giving up on career ambitions entirely. As one recent graduate told the BBC, "I studied so hard to get a good degree, but there's no future. I've sent out hundreds of applications and heard nothing back. What's the point anymore?" This generation has coined a new term for themselves, rotten tail kids, drawing a parallel to the unfinished rotten tail buildings dotting China's landscape. They spend 16-hour days studying for civil service exams, where 1.5 million applicants compete for just 37,000 government jobs, odds of just 2%. As young people lose hope, global companies are fleeing China in what economists call the Great Decoupling. Foreign direct investment continues to slide, with global manufacturers accelerating their pivot away from China. Chip makers like Intel, Infineon Technologies, and Micron Technology have poured billions into new facilities in Malaysia and Singapore. HP has expanded its laptop assembly operations in Thailand over the past 3 years, while factories in Malaysia's Penang state now produce cutting-edge AI servers. As a result, Malaysian exports of semiconductors, computers, and other electronics hit a record $137 billion in 2024, with the surge in shipments to the U.S. Meanwhile, China's dominance in notebook production is beginning to erode after accounting for nearly all global output just a few years ago. Its share is projected to fall to 80% in 2025 as Vietnam and Thailand pick up production. This shift marks more than just a supply chain adjustment. Companies that spent decades building their presence in China are now scrambling to get out, says economist Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. We're witnessing the most dramatic industrial migration in modern history. Why this exodus? Rising labor costs without rising productivity, arbitrary regulatory crackdowns, intellectual property theft, and a consumer market that's shrinking instead of growing. China's tech sector, once the crown jewel of its economic ascent, has been severely impacted by government interventions. In 2021, a sweeping regulatory crackdown led to a loss of over $1 trillion in market value among major tech firms. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, notably vanished from public view for months after criticizing financial regulators. Even foreign tech companies weren't spared. LinkedIn and Yahoo both withdrew from China that year, citing escalating compliance costs and an increasingly challenging operating environment. This aggressive stance signaled a clear message: political control takes precedence over economic growth. Consequently, venture capital investment in Chinese tech firms has plummeted by 87% from its 2018 peak. These developments underscore a deeper issue: the faltering of China's ambitious Made in China 2025 initiative. Launched in 2015, the plan aimed to transform China into a global leader in high-tech industries, reducing its reliance on foreign technology. However, studies indicate that while the initiative funneled substantial subsidies into targeted firms, it failed to produce significant improvements in productivity, R&D expenditure, or patent output. One of the most high-profile targets was the electric vehicle sector. Despite pouring over $100 billion into the industry and spawning more than 300 EV manufacturers, China's auto sector still depends heavily on foreign core technologies. In response, the government has quietly pressured firms like BYD and Geely to ramp up purchases from domestic chip makers, a telling sign of how far China remains from achieving technological self-sufficiency. The semiconductor initiative is even more revealing. The Big Fund, China's $50 billion semiconductor investment vehicle, has yielded disappointing results. In 2023, several of its executives were arrested for corruption. HSMC, once touted as a homegrown chip-making giant, collapsed after burning through billions. Meanwhile, China's most advanced chip producer, SMIC, remains stuck at 7-nanometer technology, while global leaders have already moved on to 3-nanometer and beyond. This technological dependence creates an existential vulnerability. When the United States restricted high-end chip exports to China in 2022, it effectively capped China's AI development, military modernization, and high-tech manufacturing ambitions. China's innovation model fundamentally misunderstands how technology advances, explains Dr. William Hannes of Georgetown University. They've emphasized massive capital investments and targeted goals, but innovation requires an ecosystem of intellectual freedom, risk-taking, and failure tolerance that China's system actively suppresses. Equally concerning is China's shadow banking crisis that threatens to detonate at any moment. Behind the official banking system lies a $3 trillion shadow banking sector, a complex web of wealth management products, trust companies, and off-balance sheet loans. This parallel financial system helped fuel China's growth but created massive hidden risks. In 2023, Zhongxi Enterprise Group, managing over $140 billion in assets, suddenly announced it was insolvent. Country Garden, once China's largest developer, defaulted on overseas debt. Both events sent shockwaves through China's financial system. More alarming are the bank runs that rarely make international headlines. In 2024, depositors lined up outside rural banks in Henan province after discovering their deposits, totaling $6 billion, had vanished. When they protested, local authorities manipulated their COVID health codes to restrict their movement, turning public health tools into instruments of financial repression. China's financial system is built on implicit guarantees that the government will never allow significant losses, notes Logan Wright of Rhodium Group. But as more defaults occur, that confidence is eroding rapidly. The real warning sign came in July 2024, not from a collapse, but from a historic plunge in bond yields. As money fled China's collapsing real estate market and volatile stock exchanges, investors piled into government bonds, sending prices soaring and yields to record lows. The benchmark 10-year bond yield fell to just 2.18%, its lowest level since records began in 2002. This rush into perceived safety reveals a deep lack of confidence in the broader financial system. These financial tremors expose another critical weakness: the widening divide between China's prosperous coastal regions and its struggling interior. The gleaming skylines of Shanghai and Shenzhen mask a stark reality. Much of China remains poor, with regional inequalities worse than any other major economy. The per capita GDP of Jiangsu province is 3 times higher than that of Gansu. This disparity has worsened over the past decade. The COVID pandemic exacerbated these divisions. While coastal tech hubs recovered quickly, interior manufacturing regions dependent on exports struggled to keep pace. In 2023, Yunnan province grew by just 4.4%, well below the pace of leading coastal cities. Beijing, by contrast, posted a stronger recovery with GDP growth exceeding 5%. This regional inequality creates dangerous political tensions. In 2023, protests erupted in Wuhan, where COVID first emerged, not over health resources, but in response to signals from Beijing that it would not bail out debt-laden local governments. The demonstration reflected growing frustration with the financial fallout of China's strict zero-COVID policies and the widening gap between struggling interior regions and wealthier coastal cities. In resource-rich Inner Mongolia, resentment continues to build as locals watch their coal and rare earth minerals fuel Beijing's economy, while environmental degradation remains local. China isn't one economy but several different economies moving at different speeds, explains economist Barry Naughton of UC San Diego. The coastal innovation economy, the interior manufacturing economy, and the Western resource economy are diverging rather than converging. This fragmentation undermines Beijing's ability to implement coherent economic policies. Stimulus meant for productive investment often gets captured by wealthy coastal provinces, while austerity measures hit the interior hardest, further widening disparities. But perhaps nowhere is China's economic mismanagement more evident than in its environmental crisis. Why should you care about China's problems? Because when the world's second-largest economy unravels, the shockwaves will hit every corner of the globe. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It controls 85% of global rare earth processing, manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels, and produces 76% of its lithium-ion batteries. China's economic problems represent the single largest threat to global economic stability today, warns former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. Next, global shipping and commodities markets will convulse. The Baltic Dry Index, measuring global shipping costs, has already dropped 37% since January 2023 as Chinese imports decline. Iron ore, copper, and coal prices would crash, devastating resource-dependent economies from Australia to Brazil. Manufacturing supply chains will fracture by the third quarter of 2025. Companies dependent on Chinese components will face critical shortages. Inventories of high-tech components have already fallen to alarming levels. By early 2026, financial contagion will spread as Chinese investors liquidate overseas assets to cover domestic losses. Hong Kong's property market would likely collapse first, followed by luxury real estate in Vancouver, Sydney, and London, markets where Chinese investors have been major buyers. We'd see a cascade of deleveraging that would make 2008 look orderly by comparison, explains economist Stephen Roach, former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. The healthcare sector faces unique vulnerabilities. China produces 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. A sustained disruption could trigger global medication shortages within 120 days. The FDA has already identified 63 critical medications that would be affected. European economies face particular exposure. Germany sells 33% of its automobiles to China. French luxury conglomerates derive 35% of their profits from Chinese consumers. Italy's high-end fashion houses count on Chinese tourists for 20% of European sales. Then, manufacturing supply chains would break. Everything from smartphones to automobiles requires components made in China, components that might suddenly become unavailable. Financial markets would follow. Chinese investors desperate for cash would sell foreign assets, triggering market crashes from Asia first, then Europe and America. The $61 trillion in Chinese bank assets, many of dubious quality, would be called into question, potentially freezing global interbank lending. But what's truly terrifying about this situation is how the Chinese government might respond to economic collapse. History shows that when authoritarian regimes face internal crises, they often look for external enemies to blame. There's a direct correlation between China's internal economic stress and its external belligerence, explains Dr. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution. China's increasing military aggression and threats against Taiwan aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the desperate actions of a regime that knows its economic narrative is collapsing. The warning signs are already visible. Naval encounters in the South China Sea increased by 50% in 2024. Chinese military aircraft incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone jumped from an average of 5 per week to over 20. Satellite imagery shows unprecedented military buildup along the coast facing Taiwan. Internal Chinese Communist Party documents leaked to Australian intelligence in March 2025 revealed contingency plans linking severe economic distress to decisive action on territorial integrity issues, a thinly veiled reference to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and disputed territories. Unlike previous declining powers, China has nuclear weapons, the world's largest army, and a leadership structure that fears losing control above all else. The combination of economic desperation and military capability creates an explosive mix that could lead to catastrophic miscalculation. Former Premier Li Keqiang admitted as much in a leaked conversation with diplomats, saying China's official statistics were man-made and for reference only. He relied instead on electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending as more reliable indicators. By those measures, China's economy is already faltering. Electricity usage has flatlined, rail cargo is declining, banks are forcing loans on reluctant businesses. China's economic miracle ended years ago, says Dr. Michael Beckley of Tufts University. What we're seeing now is the lag between economic reality and global perception. China's innovation economy is equally pathetic. Despite ambitious pronouncements about technological dominance, China remains dependent on foreign technology for its most crucial industries. In 2023, China imported $300 billion worth of semiconductors, more than it spent on crude oil. Its AI sector runs largely on NVIDIA chips designed in America, while its electric vehicles rely on battery technology pioneered in Japan and South Korea.
And while its aerospace industry has made progress, China still struggles to produce high-performance jet engines at scale without relying on foreign expertise or components. Even China's surveillance technologies depend on foreign-designed chips and algorithms. China excels at copying and scaling existing technologies, notes Dr. Rebecca Fanin, but true innovation requires intellectual freedom and individual rights, precisely what the Chinese system suppresses. The Chinese Communist Party's answer to these mounting crises? Authoritarian control. As economic prosperity falters, the surveillance state expands. China has installed over 700 million CCTV cameras, nearly one for every 2 citizens. Facial recognition, social credit scoring, and digital currency surveillance have become tools to maintain stability when prosperity fails. It's a new social contract, says political scientist Elizabeth Perry of Harvard. Instead of "we deliver growth, you stay quiet," it's becoming "we ensure security and stability, you follow the rules." China has overbuilt generation but underbuilt transmission, explains Dr. Lin Buquang, Dean of China Institute for Energy Policy Studies. They've prioritized visible power plants over invisible but critical infrastructure. The country's energy dependence extends beyond its borders. Despite massive investments in domestic oil production, China now imports 73% of its oil needs, up from 50% a decade ago. This dependency creates strategic vulnerabilities that military spending cannot resolve. And on the subject of military spending, China faces an impossible balancing act between guns and butter. Military expenditures have increased by 7.2% annually for the past decade, even as economic growth has slowed to 4.5% and lower. The People's Liberation Army now commands enormous financial resources. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, China's true defense spending may have reached as high as $700 billion in 2023, far higher than official figures suggest. This prioritization comes at the direct expense of social services and economic investment at a time when both are desperately needed. Flagship military programs are showing the same pattern of overpromise and underdelivery that plagues civilian initiatives. The much-hyped J-20 stealth fighter can't match American or European counterparts in engine performance. The Type 003 aircraft carrier, meant to demonstrate China's naval prowess, has faced repeated delays and technical problems. China's military budget creates a dangerous illusion of strength, notes Admiral James Stavridis, a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. They're spending enormous sums on weapons platforms that look impressive but lack the technological sophistication for modern warfare. So, what do you think? Is China's economic decline inevitable, or can Beijing somehow reverse course? How will the unraveling of the world's second-largest economy affect global markets and security in the coming decade? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more videos that expose the shocking realities behind today's biggest global stories. Now go watch 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real, and tell us what you think.